the kingdom of Judah approximately 850 years before the Common Era, a small nation carved into the hills and valleys of the ancient Near East, surrounded by hostile powers, trade routes, and the endless political machinations of empires. This was not a time of peace. This was not an era when small kingdoms survived by accident. Survival required cunning, strength, military prowess, and often brutal compromise. But Judah had something different. They had Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was not like the kings who came before him, nor like those who would come after. He ascended to the throne as a young man, inheriting a kingdom still recovering from the spiritual chaos of previous generations. His father Asa had begun reforms, tearing down pagan altars and driving out those who practiced divination and idol worship. But Jehoshaphat took it further, much further. He understood something fundamental. A kingdom's strength was not measured only in chariots and fortified cities, but in the spiritual foundation of its people. So he did something almost unheard of in the ancient world. He sent teachers throughout the land, not tax collectors, not military recruiters, teachers. These men carried scrolls containing the law, the ancient instructions given to Moses centuries before. They travelled from town to town, village to village, gathering people in the squares and teaching them. They explained the commandments, the festivals, the stories of deliverance. They reminded the people of who they were and whose they were. Jehoshaphat strengthened the cities. He built fortifications, yes, but he also established garrisons not just for defence but to maintain order and justice. He appointed judges throughout Judah, instructing them with words that would echo through history. Consider carefully what you do, because you are not judging for man but for the Lord, who is with you whenever you give a verdict. Now let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Judge carefully, for with the Lord our God there is no injustice or partiality or bribery. This was revolutionary. In a world where justice could be bought, where the powerful crushed the weak without consequence, Jehoshaphat was building something different. A kingdom where the law applied to everyone, where the wealthy could not simply purchase favourable outcomes, where the orphan and widow had the same standing as the merchant and landowner. The kingdom prospered. Trade routes brought wealth. The people experienced a season of peace. Surrounding nations, seeing Judah's growing strength and stability, thought twice before provoking conflict. Some even brought gifts and tribute, preferring alliance to warfare. Jehoshaphat expanded his influence through strategic marriages and alliances. He maintained a standing army, well-trained and well-equipped. Chronicles from that period record that he had commanders and troops numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Soldiers who trained regularly, who understood formation and discipline, who were loyal to their king and their God. For years this was enough. Judah thrived. The people worshipped freely. The harvests were good. Children grew up hearing the old stories, learning the ancient songs, understanding their identity as a chosen people with a unique covenant. But peace, as it always does in this broken world, eventually gave way to storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Chapter 2. The threat emerges. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, his face grey with exhaustion and fear. He had ridden through the night from the eastern watchtowers, changing horses at every garrison, pushing himself and his mounts to the breaking point. Because the news he carried could not wait, could not be delayed even by an hour, he was brought immediately before the king. "My lord," he said, barely able to catch his breath, "an army is coming, a vast army, from beyond the Dead Sea, from Edom. They have already crossed into our territory. They are at En-Gedi." The room fell silent. En-Gedi. That was barely a 3-day march from Jerusalem. This was not a border skirmish. This was not a raiding party. This was an invasion force, and it was already well inside Judah's borders. "Who?" Jehoshaphat demanded. "Who marches against us?" "The Moabites, my lord, and the Ammonites, and with them, others, people from Mount Seir, the numbers." The messenger paused, struggling to find words for what he had seen. "My lord, I have never seen so many. They fill the valleys like locusts. Their campfires at night look like a city made of stars. They are more than we can count." The king's advisors immediately began speaking over one another. Some called for immediate military mobilization. Others suggested sending envoys to negotiate to buy time. A few mentioned calling on allies, though everyone in the room knew Judah's alliances were political conveniences, not promises written in blood. When the moment of crisis came, they would be alone. Jehoshaphat raised his hand, silencing the room. He stood, walking to the window that overlooked Jerusalem. The city was just beginning to wake. Smoke rose from morning cooking fires. Merchants were setting up their stalls in the markets. Children played in the streets. Normal life continuing in blissful ignorance of the doom marching toward them. The situation was dire. Moab and Ammon were ancient enemies of Israel and Judah, descendants of Lot who had always harboured resentment toward their relatives who had inherited the promised land. They were fierce warriors, familiar with the desert terrain, masters of ambush and guerrilla warfare. But this was not just those two nations. The coalition included others, expanding the threat exponentially, and they had done something tactically brilliant. They had approached from the east, from the wilderness side where Judah's defences were weakest. The major fortifications faced north and west, toward the traditional threats of Aram and the coastal peoples. The eastern approach, through the rugged terrain near the Dead Sea, had always been considered too difficult for a major military operation. Apparently the enemy had decided the difficulty was worth the element of surprise. Jehoshaphat's commanders began calculating scenarios. Even with rapid mobilization, they could muster perhaps 50,000 fighting men. Disciplined? Yes. Well-trained? Certainly. But against a force that might number 3 or 4 times that size. The mathematics of warfare were brutally simple. Without a significant tactical advantage, without defensible terrain, without time to prepare proper fortifications, they would be overwhelmed. Some of the younger commanders spoke boldly of Gideon, of how God had given victory to 300 men against thousands. But the older veterans remained silent. They had seen battle. They knew what happened when infantry formations broke. They knew how quickly courage could turn to panic when the line collapsed and enemy soldiers poured through the gaps. The king turned from the window. His face was set, determined, but those closest to him could see something else in his eyes. Not panic exactly, not despair, but a deep, profound recognition of how precarious their situation had become. "Send word to every town and city," he said quietly. "We're calling a fast, the entire nation. Tomorrow, everyone who can travel is to come to Jerusalem. We're going to seek the Lord." Some of the advisors exchanged glances. A fast? Now? With an enemy army days away? Shouldn't they be marshalling troops, preparing defences, forging last-minute alliances? But Jehoshaphat was not asking for opinions. This was not a suggestion. This was a royal decree. Because he understood something his advisors were too practical to see. Some battles cannot be won with swords alone. Some enemies are too powerful for human strength to overcome. And in those moments, you either trust in something greater than yourself, or you are crushed beneath the weight of impossible odds. Messengers were dispatched immediately. Riders left Jerusalem in every direction, carrying the king's summons, a fast, a holy assembly, tomorrow. The city began to transform almost immediately. Word spread through the markets, through the neighbourhoods, through the surrounding villages. An army was coming. The king had called for prayer. Families began preparing to travel to Jerusalem. Those already in the city began preparing the squares and courtyards for the multitudes who would arrive. As the sun set that evening, Jehoshaphat stood again at his window. Somewhere to the east, beyond the hills, an enemy force was making camp, confident in their numbers, sharpening their weapons, preparing for the slaughter they anticipated. And in Jerusalem, the people of Judah were preparing something entirely different. Chapter 3. The National Fast. They came on foot, on donkeys, in carts. They came from the northern villages near Bethel and from the southern settlements near Beersheba. They came from the fortified cities and from tiny farming communities that barely appeared on any map. They came as families, as clans, as entire townships moving together along the ancient roads. By midday, Jerusalem was overflowing. The courtyards around the temple filled first, then the adjacent squares, then the streets themselves. People stood shoulder to shoulder, young and old, wealthy and poor, priests and farmers. The normal social hierarchies that structured ancient society seemed to dissolve in the face of shared danger. Parents held children in their arms, explaining in hushed voices what was happening. Elderly men and women who remembered previous wars, previous invasions, sat with sombre faces, knowing too well what an overwhelming enemy force could do to a conquered people. Young men, who days before might have boasted about their courage and readiness to fight, now stood quiet, the reality of facing a vastly superior force settling heavily on their shoulders. No cooking fires were lit, no meals were prepared. This was a fast, a complete cessation of normal life. Even the markets remained closed. The usual sounds of commerce, of daily activity, were replaced by something else, the sound of prayer. It started quietly, individuals and families praying in small groups, but gradually, like tributaries joining into a river, the prayers began to merge. Voices joined together, ancient psalms were recited, songs of deliverance from generations past were sung, the melodies carrying through the streets, a collective cry rising toward heaven. The temple priests moved through the crowds, offering guidance, leading prayers, reminding people of the covenant, of God's past faithfulness. They recounted the great deliverances, the exodus from Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the fall of Jericho, the victory of David over Goliath. Each story was not just history but a reminder, a testimony that the God they served had done impossible things before, but there was also raw honesty in the prayers. People were afraid, mothers wept, thinking of what invading armies did to children. Men confessed their doubts, their fear that this time might be different, that this enemy might be too strong. The prayers were not performances. They were the desperate cries of people who knew they were powerless, who had nowhere else to turn. As evening approached, the crowd grew even larger. Those who lived farther away had been travelling since dawn, and they continued arriving throughout the day. The gates of Jerusalem remained open, welcoming everyone. Guards who normally checked credentials and collected tolls simply waved people through. This was not a time for bureaucracy. This was national crisis, and everyone was needed. Jehoshaphat had not yet appeared publicly. He remained in the palace, in his private chambers, spending the day in his own prayers and contemplation. His advisors came periodically with updates, reports from scouts about the enemy's movements, estimates of their arrival time, suggestions for military deployment. But the king's focus was elsewhere. He had made his decision about how to face this threat, and it was not primarily a military decision. Yes, the army would be prepared. Yes, defences would be set. But the real battle, the one that would determine whether Judah survived or perished, would not be fought with bronze and iron. As darkness fell over Jerusalem, torches and lamps were lit throughout the city. The glow could be seen for miles, a city ablaze with light, filled with people who had set aside everything to seek divine intervention. The prayers continued into the night, not with the formal structure of liturgy, but with the raw desperation of people who had nowhere else to go. In the eastern wilderness, the coalition army also made camp for the night. Their scouts had reported that Judah's forces were not deploying to meet them in the field. Instead, the entire population seemed to be gathering in Jerusalem. The enemy commanders laughed at this. Retreating to the city? That just made the conquest easier. They would surround Jerusalem, cut off supplies, and wait. A siege might take weeks or months, but the outcome was inevitable. Judah would surrender or starve. But what the enemy commanders did not understand, could not understand, was that Judah was not preparing for a siege. They were preparing for something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with military strategy or defensive fortifications, something that would make the next day one of the most remarkable in the history of warfare. Chapter 4. The Prayer in the Temple. dawn broke over Jerusalem to find the crowds had not dispersed. Many had spent the entire night in prayer, sustained not by food, but by collective urgency. As the sun rose, the priest opened the inner courts of the temple, and the people pressed forward, filling every available space. Then Jehoshaphat appeared. He emerged from the palace wearing not royal regalia, not the ceremonial robes of kingship, but simple garments. He walked through the crowds, acknowledging no one, his eyes fixed ahead on the temple. The people parted to let him through, and a hush fell over the massive assembly. He entered the temple courts and positioned himself before the altar, in the place where priests typically stood to offer sacrifices. But he carried no sacrifice. He brought no offering of grain or livestock. He brought only himself and his words. The crowd pressed close, straining to hear. Those who could not fit in the temple courts filled the surrounding areas, and word of what the king said would be passed back through the crowds, repeated from person to person, until even those at the farthest edges knew what their king was praying. Jehoshaphat raised his hands toward heaven and began to speak. "Lord, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you." His voice was strong but not arrogant, confident but not presumptuous. He was stating facts, reminding himself and his people of foundational truth. The God they served was not a local deity, not a tribal protector with limited range and power. This was the creator of heaven and earth, the one who had brought their ancestors out of slavery in Egypt, who had given them this land. Our God, did you not drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel, and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham your friend? They have lived in it, and have built in it a sanctuary for your name. He was recounting history, but it was not dry recitation. It was personal. Abraham your friend. Not Abraham the patriarch, not Abraham the founder of the nation, but Abraham your friend. Reminding God and himself and everyone listening that their relationship with the divine was not transactional, but relational. Built on covenant, built on promises made and kept. If calamity comes upon us, whether the sword of judgment or plague or famine, we will stand in your presence before this temple that bears your name and will cry out to you in our distress, and you will hear us and save us. Now he was moving to the present crisis, building his case. This is what you promised. This is the covenant. We cry out, you save us. This is how it works. This is what we are doing now. His voice grew more intense, more urgent. But now here are men from Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, whose territory you would not allow Israel to invade when they came from Egypt. So they turned away from them and did not destroy them. See how they are repaying us by coming to drive us out of the possession you gave us as an inheritance. There was anger in his voice now, righteous indignation. We obeyed you. When our ancestors could have conquered these peoples, we held back because you told us to. We showed mercy, and now they repay that mercy with invasion. With attempted genocide, the crowd murmured in agreement. Yes, this was unjust. This was wrong. They had honoured God's commands even when it seemed militarily foolish to leave potential enemies unconquered on their borders, and this was how they were repaid. Then Jehoshaphat's voice changed. The anger faded, replaced by something else. Vulnerability, honesty. The raw admission that every person in that crowd was feeling, but most were too proud to say out loud. Our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We have no power. 4 words that no king wanted to speak. 4 words that admitted weakness, that confessed inadequacy, that laid bare the truth everyone knew, but no one wanted to acknowledge. We have no power. The trained army, insufficient. The fortifications, inadequate. The strategic position, untenable. The military advisors, with all their experience and tactical knowledge, out of solutions. We have no power. But Jehoshaphat was not finished, because admitting powerlessness was not the same as admitting defeat. Confessing human limitation was not the same as accepting destruction. There was one more sentence, one more phrase that would transform everything. "We do not know what to do." A pause. The crowd held its breath. "But our eyes are on you." Silence. Absolute silence. Thousands of people and not a sound. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. "Our eyes are on you, not on our army, not on our walls, not on our strategy or our weapons or our desperate last-minute plans. Our eyes are on you." Jehoshaphat lowered his hands. He stood there, before the altar, before the assembled nation, having laid out the situation with brutal honesty, having confessed their complete inability to save themselves, having placed everything, the survival of the nation, the lives of every person in that crowd, in the hands of the God they served. All of Judah stood before the Lord with their wives and children and little ones. They waited, because now it was not their turn to act. They had done what they could do. They had fasted. They had prayed. They had confessed. They had trusted. Now they waited to see if trust would be enough. Chapter 5. The prophetic response. The silence stretched. 1 minute. 2. 5. People shifted uncomfortably, wondering what would happen next. Some expected the king to continue speaking. Others thought perhaps the high priest would offer additional prayers. But no one spoke. The assembly remained in expectant stillness. Then something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the midst of the crowd, a man began to move forward. His name was Jahaziel, a Levite, a temple musician, a member of the family of Asaph. He was not high-ranking, not a priest, not a political figure, just a worship leader, someone who on a normal day would have been in the background, supporting the formal religious ceremonies. But something had come upon him. The Spirit of the Lord, the ancient texts would later record. He pushed through the crowd, not rudely but with unmistakable urgency, making his way toward where the king stood. People recognized the signs. This was prophetic utterance, the same phenomenon that had marked the judges, the prophets, the great voices that had spoken divine truth into crucial moments throughout their history. Jahaziel's face had changed. His normal expression was replaced by an intensity, a focus that suggested he was seeing and hearing something beyond the physical realm. He reached the front of the assembly and turned to face the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was loud and clear, carrying across the courtyard with unusual power. "Listen, King Jehoshaphat and all who live in Judah and Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says to you." The crowd leaned forward. "This is what the Lord says. Not I think, not perhaps, not in my opinion. This is what the Lord says. Direct communication, divine revelation, the answer they had been waiting for. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army. Do not be afraid." The first words, not here is a complex military strategy, not call on your allies, not prepare for a long siege. Do not be afraid, for the battle is not yours, but God's. The battle is not yours. Every military leader in the crowd knew what that meant. They were being told to stand down, to set aside their training, their weapons, their carefully planned defensive positions. The battle is not yours. You're not the primary actors in this conflict, but God's. This is about something larger than national survival. This is about divine reputation. This is about God's covenant faithfulness being put on display before watching nations. The enemy might think they are marching against Judah, but they have actually picked a fight with something far beyond their comprehension. Jahaziel continued, and now his voice took on additional urgency, because he was giving specific instructions. Tomorrow march down against them. They will be climbing up by the pass of Ziz, and you will find them at the end of the gorge in the desert of Jeruel. Specific geographic locations. This was not vague spiritual encouragement. This was actionable intelligence. The pass of Ziz was a known route through the wilderness. The desert of Jeruel was a specific area. The prophecy included practical details because faith was not divorced from reality. Trust in divine intervention did not mean ignoring geography and terrain. You will not have to fight this battle. The core message, repeated for emphasis. You will not have to fight. Not you will fight and be victorious. Not you will fight and I will help you. You will not have to fight. Take up your positions. Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will give you, Judah and Jerusalem. Take up your positions. So they were to march out. They were to deploy as if for battle. This was not passive waiting in the city. Stand firm. Military language. Hold your ground, but see the deliverance. You are spectators in this battle. Witnesses, not warriors. Jahaziel's voice rose to a crescendo, repeating the opening command. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Go out to face them tomorrow, and the Lord will be with you. Then the prophetic mantle lifted. Jahaziel staggered slightly, as if released from a force that had been holding him upright. Others reached out to steady him. He looked around, seeming momentarily disoriented, as if waking from a deep sleep. But the words remained, hanging in the air, reverberating in the minds and hearts of everyone who had heard them. Jehoshaphat, still standing before the altar, slowly lowered himself to his knees. Then he bent forward until his face touched the ground, a position of complete humility, complete submission. The king of Judah, prostrate in the dirt, before God and before the assembled nation. And the people followed. Like a wave spreading across the courtyard, people dropped to their knees, then fell forward, faces to the ground. Thousands upon thousands, an entire nation in worship, responding not with skepticism or doubt, but with gratitude and trust. Then something remarkable happened. The Levites, the temple musicians, the singers, those whose normal role was to lead worship during festivals and ceremonies, began to stand. They moved to the front, forming spontaneous choirs, and they began to sing. Not somber songs of pleading, not desperate cries for mercy. They sang songs of praise, songs of thanksgiving, songs celebrating victory that had not yet happened, deliverance that existed only as a promise. Their voices rose strong and confident, filling the temple courts, spilling out into the streets, carrying across the city walls into the surrounding countryside. The time for prayer was over. The time for fasting was complete. Now was the time for worship, because they had received their answer. And the answer was not a strategy. The answer was a promise. Tomorrow they would march to war. But they would not be marching as warriors preparing for combat. They would be marching as worshippers, preparing to witness a miracle. Chapter 6. Worship before warfare. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. The people had spent the night in restless anticipation, some trying to sleep, others too filled with nervous energy to rest. Families held each other, unsure what the next day would bring, but choosing to trust the prophetic word they had received. As dawn light touched the eastern hills, the army began to assemble. But this was not a normal military mobilization. The usual protocols were being violated, the standard formations abandoned, because the instructions they had received were anything but standard. Jehoshaphat stood before his assembled forces. Behind him, the palace. Before him, thousands of men in various stages of military readiness. Some wore full armour, others carried only simple weapons. All watched their king, waiting for orders. We march to the desert of Jeruel, Jehoshaphat announced. His voice was steady, calm. We march in faith, trusting not in our own strength but in the God who has promised deliverance. Then he gave an order that caused visible confusion among the assembled troops. The singers go first. Silence. The soldiers looked at each other, certain they had misheard. The singers? In battle formation, the best troops led. The most experienced, heavily armoured warriors took point position. They absorbed the initial enemy contact, held the line while the rest of the force deployed. That was fundamental military doctrine, unchanged for centuries. But Jehoshaphat was not finished. Those appointed to sing to the Lord and to praise him for the splendour of his holiness will go out at the head of the army. The Levites, the temple musicians, those who normally stood in protected positions during any conflict, were being told to march in front, where casualties were highest. where the danger was greatest. They were being told to lead with worship. One of the military commanders stepped forward, choosing his words carefully. "My lord, if the enemy engages us, the singers will be the first to fall. They are not trained for combat. They do not wear armour. If we encounter the coalition forces, they will be slaughtered before the soldiers can even deploy." Jehoshaphat turned to face the commander. His expression was not angry, but it was firm. "The battle is not ours. Those are not my words. Those are the Lord's words, spoken through Jahaziel. We were told to take up positions and stand firm. We were told we would not have to fight, so we will do exactly what we were instructed to do." He turned back to the Levites, to the singers who now stood at the front of the assembly, many looking distinctly uncomfortable with their new position. "Sing," the king commanded. "Give praise to the Lord, for his love endures forever." The singers exchanged glances. This was insane. They were marching toward an army that outnumbered them several times over, and they were supposed to sing. Not war chants, not battle cries designed to intimidate the enemy and build courage in their own ranks, but worship songs. But Jehoshaphat had given an order, and he was their king. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence they began. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." The ancient refrain sung at festivals, at celebrations, at moments of thanksgiving, but never at the start of a military campaign, never marching toward battle. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." Other voices joined in. Soldiers began singing along. The words were familiar, burned into their memories from childhood, from countless religious observances. The melody was simple, repetitive, easy to maintain even while marching. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." The formation began to move. The singers at the front, their voices carrying across the early morning air. Behind them, the soldiers, still armed, still ready for combat, but singing. Behind them, support personnel, supplies, medical attendants, and scattered throughout more singers, more musicians, keeping the song going, preventing it from fading. They marched east, toward the wilderness, toward the approaching enemy, toward what every military strategist would have called certain defeat. But they marched singing. The sun climbed higher. The terrain grew rougher as they left the cultivated lands around Jerusalem and entered the rocky wilderness. The pass of Ziz, as Jahaziel had prophesied, lay ahead. Scouts reported no contact with enemy forces. The coalition army was apparently still advancing, confident, taking their time because they believed Judah was trapped. The singing continued, hour after hour. When the Levites grew tired, soldiers picked up the melody. When one group's voices grew hoarse, another section of the formation took over. The song never stopped. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." Some soldiers wept as they marched and sang, not from fear, though certainly fear was present, but from something else, a strange sense of rightness, of being exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, even though everything about it contradicted common sense. They were worshipping their way into battle, praising their way toward an enemy who intended to destroy them. And somehow, impossibly, it felt like the only appropriate response. The column stretched for miles now, a river of humanity flowing through the wilderness, and the sound of their singing echoed off the rocky cliffs, amplified by the terrain, carrying for incredible distances. Somewhere ahead, the enemy would hear them coming. And what would they think? An army that announced its approach with hymns, soldiers who sang about love and faithfulness rather than strength and conquest. The coalition commanders would likely view it as further evidence of Judah's weakness. Psychological warfare perhaps, but ultimately futile. You could not win battles with songs. But Judah was not trying to win a battle. They were making space for God to do what only God could do. And what happened next would become legend, told and retold for generations, a story so extraordinary that many would struggle to believe it, except that it was witnessed by thousands and changed the course of nations. Chapter 7. The Battle That Fought Itself. The terrain changed as Judah's forces approached the desert of Jeruel. The path narrowed, forcing the formation to compress. Rocky outcroppings rose on either side. It was perfect ambush territory, the kind of ground where a smaller force could inflict devastating casualties on a larger one. The scouts had gone ahead, cautious, expecting at any moment to encounter enemy forward elements. They climbed ridges, checked valleys, searched for signs of the coalition army that intelligence suggested should be nearby. Then one scout returned, riding hard, his face not showing fear but confusion. He approached the king's position, slid from his horse, knelt briefly, then stood, struggling to find words for what he had seen. "My lord, the enemy." "Speak," Jehoshaphat commanded. The singing had paused, the entire formation waiting for the scout's report. "They are destroyed, my lord. The valley ahead. There are bodies everywhere, but not our people, them, the coalition. They appear to have killed each other." Silence. Then murmuring rippled through the ranks. "Killed each other? How? Why?" "You're certain?" the king asked. "My lord, I went to the ridge overlooking the valley. I saw the camps, the banners, Moabite, Ammonite, men from Seir, all mixed together, and all dead or dying. There is no organized force remaining. Whatever happened, it was catastrophic." Jehoshaphat closed his eyes briefly, and those near him saw his lips moving in silent prayer. Then he opened his eyes and gave the order. "We advance, carefully. Prepare for possible survivors or ambush. But we go forward." The formation moved again, now with heightened alertness. Soldiers gripped weapons, scanning the terrain. Officers barked orders, maintaining discipline, preventing the ranks from breaking into a disorganized rush. They rounded a bend, and the valley of Jeruel opened before them. What they saw defied comprehension. The valley floor was carpeted with bodies, thousands upon thousands, equipment scattered everywhere, tents collapsed, campfires burned down to ash, weapons lying unused beside those who would never wield them again. It was the aftermath of a battle, but it had not been Judah's battle. The Judean forces spread out cautiously, moving through the scene, trying to understand what had happened. The evidence told a story, fragmentary but clear enough. The coalition had made camp here, confident, preparing for the final push toward Jerusalem. Then something had gone wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. Perhaps it started with a misunderstanding in the dark. Different languages, different tribal markings. The Moabites, Ammonites, and peoples from Mount Seir were allies of convenience, not unified by language or culture. Bound together by a common enemy, but lacking the deep trust that comes from long alliance. In the darkness, perhaps a Moabite patrol encountered Ammonite sentries. Neither side recognized the other immediately. Someone panicked. A weapon was drawn, blood was shed. The fighting spread. Units hearing combat in the night assumed they were under attack. They grabbed weapons, rallied to defend their section of camp, and in the confusion they attacked whoever was nearest. Once started, the violence became self-perpetuating. Old grudges surfaced. Ancient rivalries between tribes that had been temporarily suppressed for the campaign now erupted. The unified coalition dissolved into chaos, each group fighting for survival against everyone else. By morning, the army that had seemed invincible had destroyed itself. Some Judean soldiers simply stood, staring, unable to process the scene. Others wept, overwhelmed by relief and awe. This was the deliverance they had been promised. This was the battle they did not have to fight. Jehoshaphat walked through the valley, his personal guard surrounding him, surveying the destruction. He paused occasionally, looking at abandoned banners, at siege equipment that would never be used, at supply wagons full of provisions that had been meant to sustain an occupation of Judah. "The battle is not yours, but God's," the king whispered, repeating Jahaziel's prophetic word. "You will not have to fight this battle." It had been literal truth, not metaphor, not spiritual encouragement, actual physical reality. They had not fought, They had marched, singing, and arrived to find their enemies already defeated by forces beyond human comprehension or control. The commanders began organising collection teams. The prophetic word had said they would see deliverance. It had not mentioned what would come after. But ancient customs of warfare were clear. The victor claimed the spoils, and spread across this valley were the supplies, weapons, equipment, and valuables of 3 armies. "Gather everything," Jehoshaphat ordered, "clothes, equipment, valuables, all of it. But take nothing that is forbidden, no idols, no objects of pagan worship. We will take what can be sanctified and used, and we will destroy the rest." The collection began. It would take days. The amount of material was staggering. Armour and weapons, yes, but also gold and silver, precious stones, fine fabrics. The coalition armies had been confident enough to bring their wealth with them, perhaps anticipating a long occupation, perhaps planning to use it to hire additional mercenaries after Judah fell. Now it would go to Judah instead, not as conquest taken through violence, but as provision given through divine intervention. The soldiers worked systematically, gathering materials, sorting, organising. The mood was subdued despite the magnitude of the victory. There was joy, yes, but also a kind of sacred awe. They were walking through a demonstration of power that made human military might seem trivial by comparison. As the first day of collection ended and the Judean forces made camp in the valley, Jehoshaphat called his commanders together. "Tomorrow we continue the collection. It will take at least 3 days, perhaps 4. When we're finished, we return to Jerusalem. But we do not return as conquering warriors. We return as witnesses. What happened here will be told to our children and our children's children. This valley will be remembered." One of the commanders spoke up. "My lord, what should we call this place? It needs a name that captures what happened here." Jehoshaphat looked around the valley, at the camps of his people, at the evidence of destruction that had not come by their hand, at the lavish provision that had come from the enemy's own supplies. "We will call it the Valley of Berekah," he said quietly, "the Valley of Blessing." Because that was what it was, not a battlefield in the traditional sense, a place where curse had been transformed into blessing, where intended destruction had become unexpected provision, where human impossibility had encountered divine faithfulness, and found that faith was stronger than fear, stronger than armies, stronger than any coalition of human power, the Valley of Blessing. The name would stick, lasting for centuries, a permanent memorial to the day when worship won a battle that swords could never have won. Chapter 8. The Valley of Blessing. For 3 full days Judah remained in the valley. The collection of spoils continued from sunrise to sunset, requiring careful organisation to manage the enormous quantity of materials. The armour alone represented wealth beyond calculation. Bronze helmets, chest plates, shin guards, shields, all sized for warriors, but the metal could be melted down and reforged for Judah's own forces or sold to traders. The weapons were of exceptional quality. The coalition had clearly spared no expense in equipping their troops, confident that superior numbers and better equipment would guarantee victory. Then there were the supplies: grain, oil, wine, dried meat, enough to feed Judah's entire army for months. Tents, cooking equipment, water containers, everything needed to sustain a military campaign, medical supplies, tools, rope, pack animals, donkeys and camels, wandering loose through the valley, now rounded up and claimed. But the most stunning discoveries were the valuables: gold and silver in astonishing quantities, precious stones, fine clothing, musical instruments. Apparently some of the coalition forces had brought their family wealth with them, either because they expected to be gone for an extended period, or because they planned to settle in Judah after conquering it. The Levites oversaw the collection, ensuring that forbidden items were identified and destroyed rather than taken. Idols, ritual objects associated with pagan worship, anything that might bring spiritual corruption into Judah. These were gathered separately and burned. The soldiers worked with an interesting mixture of efficiency and reverence. This was not looting in the traditional sense. This was harvesting a field they had not planted, gathering fruit from trees they had not cultivated. They worked diligently, but without the frenzy or greed that often accompanied battlefield plunder. Each evening, as the sun set, the camp gathered for worship. The Levites led, but increasingly everyone participated. They sang the same songs they had sung on the march, but now with different emotional resonance. Then it had been faith without evidence. Now it was thanksgiving based on witnessed reality. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. The words carried across the valley, a counterpoint to the silence of death that had defined this place days before. Where confusion and violence had reigned, now there was order and peace. Where enemies had destroyed themselves, now allies worked together, building community even in the process of collecting the remains of war. Jehoshaphat spent time each day walking through the site, often alone except for a single guard. He studied the scene, fixing it in his memory. He understood that he had witnessed something few kings ever saw, a clear, unmistakable demonstration that divine power was real and could act decisively in human affairs. This was not a battle won through superior tactics or a fortuitous alliance or even exceptional courage by his troops. This was intervention, pure and simple. Judah had shown up and watched God fight their battle for them. On the third evening, the king called a special assembly. The entire camp gathered, and he stood before them, his voice carrying in the still air. "We came to this valley expecting to fight," he began. "We came prepared to die if necessary. We came trusting a promise that seemed impossible, and we found that faith in God's word is never misplaced." He paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd. Soldiers who had feared they would never see their families again. Young men who had been prepared to give their lives in defense of their nation. Old veterans who had seen battle before and knew how rarely conflicts ended with 0 friendly casualties. "Tomorrow we begin the journey home. We will return to Jerusalem carrying more than we could have imagined. But the true treasure is not the gold or silver. It is the knowledge that the God we serve is faithful, that when we do not know what to do but our eyes are on him, he acts." The crowd murmured agreement. Then someone began to sing, and others joined in, and soon the entire assembly was engaged in spontaneous worship. Not because it was scheduled or required, but because the only appropriate response to what they had experienced was gratitude. That night, lying in his tent, Jehoshaphat thought about the political implications. Word would spread. Other nations would hear what happened. How would they respond? With fear, certainly. With caution. Small kingdoms survived by being either powerful enough to deter attack or too insignificant to be worth conquering. Judah had just demonstrated a third option. Protection that came not from military strength or political irrelevance, but from divine favour. The surrounding nations would think twice before attacking. Not because they feared Judah's army, but because they would wonder if Judah's God would fight on their behalf again. Chapter 9. Peace restored. The return to Jerusalem was unlike any military homecoming in memory. Usually armies returned either in grim silence after defeat, or in boisterous celebration after hard-won victory. This was neither. The column moved slowly, burdened with the enormous quantity of spoils. Pack animals, carts, soldiers carrying bundles. Behind them the Valley of Blessing already becoming a landmark, a place that would be pointed out to travellers for generations. As they approached Jerusalem, lookouts spotted them and raced ahead to spread the news. The army was returning, and they were intact. No evidence of casualties, and loaded with plunder. The city gates opened, and the people poured out to meet them. The scene was chaotic with joy. Families reunited. Children ran to their fathers. Wives embraced husbands they had feared they would never see again. But beneath the celebration was something deeper. As the story spread, told by soldiers to their families, shared in the streets, repeated in the markets, the people began to understand what had actually happened. This was not a normal military victory. This was not even an extraordinary military victory. This was something else entirely. God had fought for them. literally, physically, decisively, while they watched. The procession continued through the city streets toward the temple. Jehoshaphat led, but the focus was not on the king. This was not a royal triumph. This was a national thanksgiving. At the temple, the priests were ready. The king had sent word ahead, and preparations had been made for proper sacrifices of thanksgiving. The altars burned continuously for days as the nation brought offerings, not as obligation, but as overflow of gratitude. Jehoshaphat stood before the people again, this time in the temple courts where just days before he had confessed their helplessness. "We asked the Lord what to do," he said. "We confessed we had no power to face the vast army attacking us. We admitted we did not know what to do, but our eyes were on him." The crowd listened, many of them having been present for that original prayer, and he answered, not with a complex strategy, not with a demand for greater faith. He answered with a simple command: "Do not be afraid. The battle is not yours. You will not have to fight. Go out tomorrow and see what I will do." Jehoshaphat's voice grew stronger. "We obeyed. We went out. We took the singers with us, worshipping our way toward what should have been our destruction. And we found our enemies had destroyed themselves. We collected spoils for 3 days. We renamed the valley Blessing because that is what it became." He paused. Then his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the crowd's attention, everyone heard. "Remember this. When fear comes, when circumstances overwhelm, when the odds are impossible, remember that the battle is not ours. Remember that our God fights for those who trust him." The days that followed were unlike anything Jerusalem had experienced. It was celebration, yes, but also deep national reflection. The event had been too dramatic, too clear, to be brushed aside or explained away. Even the most sceptical, those who tended toward practical politics and military realism, could not deny what had happened. And the impact rippled outward. Traders carried the story to other cities. Travellers heard it and shared it in distant regions. The news spread across the ancient Near East. Judah's enemies had destroyed themselves. Judah's God had fought their battle for them. The response from surrounding nations was immediate and dramatic. Kings who had been considering military action against Judah reconsidered. Tribute that had been slow in coming arrived promptly. Alliances that had been conditional became more concrete. The text from that period is direct. The fear of God came on all the surrounding kingdoms when they heard how the Lord had fought against the enemies of Israel, and the kingdom of Jehoshaphat was at peace, for his God had given him rest on every side, peace, not negotiated through treaties or maintained through military deterrence, peace that came because potential adversaries decided that attacking Judah was simply too dangerous. Not because of Judah's strength, but because of their God's demonstrated willingness to intervene. For years afterward, Judah experienced stability. Trade flourished. The population grew. The reforms Jehoshaphat had instituted took deeper root. The teaching of the law continued. Justice was administered fairly. The temple remained the centre of national life. But what persisted most strongly was the memory. Parents told their children. Teachers incorporated the story into instruction. Singers composed songs about it. The Valley of Blessing became a pilgrimage site, a place where people would go to remember, to give thanks, to strengthen their own faith by standing where the impossible had happened. Because that was ultimately what the story was about, not military strategy, not political manoeuvring, not human cleverness or strength. It was about what happened when a nation faced impossible odds, confessed their helplessness, trusted a promise that seemed absurd, and discovered that faith was not weakness, but the doorway to power beyond human comprehension. Epilogue. Victory through trust. Years later, long after the events at the Valley of Blessing, an elderly Jehoshaphat would reflect on his reign. He had faced many challenges. He had made mistakes, as all leaders do. He had navigated complex political situations, managed internal conflicts, dealt with the endless complications of governing a small nation surrounded by larger powers. But when asked about the defining moment of his kingship, he always returned to that valley, to the day when singing replaced strategy, when worship won a battle that weapons never could have. The lesson was not that military strength was irrelevant. Judah maintained its army, kept its fortifications, continued to train soldiers, but the people never forgot that their ultimate security came not from chariots or cavalry, but from covenant relationship with a God who was faithful to his promises. That knowledge changed how they faced subsequent challenges, not with false confidence or presumption, but with a deep-rooted trust that when they did what they could, and then looked to God for the rest, he would be faithful. The story spread far beyond Judah's borders. It became part of the cultural memory not just of one nation, but of many. Centuries later, people who had never heard of Jehoshaphat, who could not have pointed to the Valley of Blessing on a map, still told stories about the time an army was defeated by singing. Because it touched something universal in human experience, the feeling of being overwhelmed, of facing odds that seem insurmountable, of reaching the end of your own strength and resources and having nowhere else to turn. In those moments, the story of Jehoshaphat whispered a possibility. Maybe the battle is not yours. Maybe your inadequacy is not the end of the story. Maybe there is power available to those who are willing to admit their weakness and trust something greater than themselves. Not every crisis ends like the Valley of Blessing. Not every prayer receives such a dramatic answer. The world is complex, and faith does not eliminate suffering or guarantee earthly success. But the story remains, preserved across millennia, because it witnessed a truth that remains true. When fear surrounds us, trust can become our greatest defense. When we face enemies too strong for us to defeat, worship can be an act of warfare. When we do not know what to do, fixing our eyes on divine faithfulness is not naive optimism, but profound wisdom. The coalition army approached the Valley of Jeruel with overwhelming force, confident in their numbers, certain of victory. They had planned for every military contingency. They had brought sufficient supplies. They had coordinated between multiple nations. What they had not planned for was the possibility that their target was protected by something beyond military calculation. That Judah's confession of weakness would become a doorway to strength. That songs of praise would prove more powerful than swords. The sun sets now over what was once called the Valley of Blessing. The ancient battles are long finished. The kingdoms that fought them have crumbled into dust. The soldiers who witnessed the impossible have been gone for centuries. But the lesson remains, passed down through generations, preserved in text and memory, and the lived experience of countless individuals who have faced their own impossible battles. Sometimes the greatest victories come not through fighting, but through faith. Not through strength, but through surrender. Not through knowing what to do, but through admitting you do not know, and turning your eyes toward the one who does. The battle is not always yours. Sometimes you're called simply to take your position, stand firm, worship, and watch what God will do. And when fear surrounds you, when the odds are overwhelming, when you have exhausted your own resources and strategies, remember a small nation that faced a vast army with singing. Remember a king who confessed helplessness and found power. Remember a valley where intended destruction became unexpected blessing. Remember that trust can be a weapon more powerful than any forged from bronze or iron. That faith is not weakness, but the doorway to strength beyond human comprehension. Remember and take courage. The battle may not be yours at all. Hey everyone, welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something that would genuinely help us out. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know. Seriously, it makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people who love this kind of content. Also, if you want to, drop a comment telling us what time it is for you right now and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. No pressure though, only if you feel like it. And of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It keeps us going. Alright, let's get into it. A whisper in the darkness. Imagine a night so quiet you can hear the oil lamps flickering. Picture a massive stone sanctuary in the ancient city of Shiloh, where shadows dance across walls that have witnessed centuries of worship. The air is thick with the scent of incense and burning oil, that peculiar combination of cedar smoke and olive essence that clings to sacred spaces. Outside, the wind moves through the hills of Israel like a whispered prayer, carrying with it the distant bleating of sheep settling for the night and the occasional call of a desert owl. Inside, in the sacred chambers near the Ark of the Covenant, a young boy lies sleeping on a simple mat. The stones beneath him still hold the warmth of the day's sun, though the night air has begun to cool. His breathing is steady, deep, the kind of sleep that comes from honest physical labour and a clear conscience. His name is Samuel. This is not a story about miracles that shake mountains or angels descending in blinding light. This is a story about something quieter, something more intimate, something that happens in the space between waking and dreaming, where the boundaries of reality become permeable. It is about a voice in the darkness, a child who learned to listen when the entire world had gone deaf, and a moment that would alter the spiritual trajectory of an entire nation. Because sometimes the most profound truths do not arrive with thunder and earthquake. Sometimes they do not announce themselves with burning bushes or pillars of fire. Sometimes they arrive in whispers, in the stillness between breaths, in the gentle calling of a name spoken 3 times before it is finally understood. What you're about to hear is one of the most mysterious and beautiful moments in ancient scripture. A moment when heaven reached down to touch earth, not through spectacular signs, but through the simple act of calling a child's name in the night. But it is also a story about silence broken, about the end of a spiritual drought, about what happens when the divine decides to speak again after generations of absence. This is the story of Samuel, the boy who heard God speak when the rest of the world had forgotten how to listen, and perhaps, hidden within this ancient narrative, there are questions we have forgotten to ask. Questions about why heaven goes silent. Questions about who gets chosen to break that silence. Questions about whether the voice that called to Samuel in that darkened sanctuary is still calling, still speaking, still searching for those rare individuals who know how to say, "I am listening." Chapter 1. Hannah's Promise. To understand Samuel's calling, we must first understand how he came to be sleeping in that sanctuary. His story begins not with him, but with his mother, a woman named Hannah, who knew the bitter taste of desperation and the hollow ache of prayers that seemed to vanish into an empty sky. In the hill country of Ephraim, in a small village whose name has been lost to history, there lived a man named Elkanah who had 2 wives, as was common in that era. His first wife, Peninnah, had given him several children, sons to carry his name, daughters to arrange in marriage, a legacy written in flesh and blood. His second wife, Hannah, had given him only heartache and unanswered prayers. Year after year, Hannah remained childless, and in a culture where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear children, this was not just a personal grief. It was a social death sentence, a daily humiliation, a question mark hanging over her entire existence. Neighbours would whisper, extended family would exchange knowing glances, even well-meaning friends would offer useless advice, or suggest that perhaps she had offended God in some way, that her barrenness was divine punishment for some unknown sin. Elkanah loved Hannah. The text makes this clear. He would give her double portions at feasts, trying to compensate with material generosity for what biology had denied her. He He would ask her with genuine confusion, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" It was a question born of love but blind to understanding. He could not fathom that the issue went deeper than his affection, that Hannah's grief was not about him at all, but about her own sense of purpose, of completion, of being seen as fully human by the society around her. Peninnah, with the cruelty that can only come from insecurity dressed as triumph, would taunt Hannah relentlessly. Every time the family made their annual pilgrimage to the sanctuary at Shiloh to worship and offer sacrifices, Peninnah would remind Hannah of her barrenness. The taunts were not subtle. They were designed to cut deep, to remind Hannah that in the eyes of the world she was incomplete, cursed, forgotten by the very God she came to worship. Peninnah would parade her children before Hannah, would make comments about how blessed she was, would turn every moment of worship into a reminder of Hannah's failure. And Hannah would weep. She would refuse to eat. The pain went beyond physical longing for a child. It touched something deeper, the existential question that haunts anyone who feels overlooked by the divine. Does God see me? Does he hear my prayers? Am I worthy of his attention? Or am I simply background noise in a universe too vast to care about one woman's grief? The pilgrimage to Shiloh was supposed to be a time of joy, of celebration, of renewal. But for Hannah, it became an annual reminder of everything she lacked. Year after year she would go through the motions of worship, while her heart broke quietly in places no one could see. One year, during their pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah could bear it no longer. The weight of accumulated grief, the years of disappointment, the constant humiliation, all of it reached a breaking point. While the rest of the family feasted after the sacrifice, celebrating with wine and roasted meat, Hannah slipped away to the entrance of the sanctuary. She stood there, in the place where earth met heaven, in the threshold between the mundane and the sacred, and she prayed with an intensity that went beyond words. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Her whole body shook with the force of her grief and desperation. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands trembled. This was not the polite, ritualized prayer of public worship. This was raw, unfiltered communion with the divine. This was a woman pouring out her soul, holding nothing back, demanding to be heard by a God who had seemed deaf to her pleas for years. She made a vow that day, one that would echo through generations. If God would grant her a son, she would give him back to God. Not for a season, not for a few years, but for his entire life. The child would be dedicated to divine service from the moment he was weaned. It was the prayer of a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is not something to hold on to, but something to offer back to its source. She was not bargaining with God so much as she was declaring her willingness to participate in something larger than her own desires. Eli, the high priest, sat by the doorpost of the sanctuary and watched this strange woman swaying and muttering. In his aging, perhaps cynical view of human nature shaped by years of dealing with corrupt worshippers and his own corrupt sons, he assumed she was drunk. The accusation was harsh, almost cruel. What are you doing here, intoxicated in the house of the Lord? How dare you bring your drunkenness into this sacred space? Hannah lifted her eyes, and in them Eli saw not the glaze of wine, but the clarity of absolute desperation, the look of someone who has nothing left to lose, who has stripped away all pretense and pride, who stands naked before God with only their need. She explained that she was not drunk, but deeply troubled, pouring out her soul before God. She had been praying out of her great anguish and grief. Something in her words, or perhaps in her eyes, or perhaps in the raw authenticity of her pain, convinced Eli. His response was both blessing and prophecy. Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant what you have asked of him. It is unclear whether Eli knew what he was saying, whether he was simply offering the standard priestly blessing, or whether something moved through him in that moment. Some whisper of the divine speaking through a man who had grown complacent in his religious duties. But the words landed on Hannah like rain on parched earth. Hannah left the sanctuary that day transformed. Her face was no longer downcast. She ate. The grief lifted from her countenance like a fog dispersing under the morning sun. She had been heard, if not by man, then by something infinitely greater. She did not yet have the child she longed for, but she had something perhaps more precious. The certainty that her prayers had reached their destination, that her voice had penetrated the silence, that she mattered to the God she served. Within the year, Hannah conceived. When she gave birth to a son, she named him Samuel, which in Hebrew carries the meaning heard by God, or asked of God, or some translations suggest name of God. The name itself was a testimony, a permanent reminder that this child was an answer to prayer, a gift that came from somewhere beyond the ordinary workings of the world. Every time someone spoke his name, they were acknowledging that this boy represented the moment when heaven responded to earth, when silence gave way to acknowledgement. For the first few years of his life, Samuel remained with Hannah. She nursed him, taught him his first words, held him close during thunderstorms, watched him take his first steps, knowing that each day brought them closer to the moment of separation. She must have memorized the sound of his laugh, the feel of his small hand in hers, the weight of him sleeping against her chest. She was not raising a son to keep, but a son to give away, and that knowledge must have coloured every moment with a bittersweet intensity. When he was old enough to be weaned, somewhere around 3 years old by the customs of that time, Hannah kept her vow. She could have rationalised her way out of it. She could have argued that God understood, that the vow was made in a moment of emotional extremity, that surely keeping her son would be acceptable. But Hannah was a woman who understood that integrity means keeping promises even when they cost you everything. She took Samuel to Shiloh. She brought him before Eli, the same priest who had blessed her years earlier, and she said words that must have torn her heart even as she spoke them. I am the woman who stood here praying. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. Then Hannah sang, not a lament, but a song of triumph and praise. She sang of God overturning the proud and lifting up the humble. She sang of barren women bearing children and the powerful being brought low. She sang of the Lord bringing death and giving life, bringing down to the grave and raising up. She sang of God judging the ends of the earth, giving strength to his king and exalting his anointed. Her song was radical, revolutionary, a declaration that the God she served delighted in reversing the expectations of the world, in using the weak to shame the strong, in lifting up those the world had written off as irrelevant. And then she left her son in that sanctuary and went home. Imagine being that child, too young to fully understand why your mother brought you to this vast, echoing building filled with strange smells and unfamiliar faces and then walked away. Too young to grasp that you had become the physical embodiment of a promise, a living prayer offered back to its source. You watch her figure receding, growing smaller, disappearing down the road back to the only home you have ever known, and you are left in the care of an old man whose eyes can barely see you, whose own sons are corrupt, in a place that will become your entire world. Samuel's childhood was unlike any other in Israel. While other boys played in fields and learned their father's trades, running through olive groves and swimming in streams, Samuel grew up in the sacred space of the tabernacle. His world was one of ritual and reverence, of ancient objects and whispered prayers, of shadows and lamplight, and the constant awareness that this place was different from all other places. He opened the doors of the sanctuary each morning, flooding the holy space with light. It was his job to unlock the heavy wooden doors that seal the sacred from the profane, to let in the dawn and with it the worshippers who would come seeking connection with the divine. He assisted Eli in the daily tasks of worship, learning the intricate patterns of sacrifice and ceremony, memorizing which offerings required which procedures, understanding the difference between sin offerings and burnt offerings and peace offerings, learning to read the subtleties of ritual purity. He tended the lamps that burned through the night, ensuring their wicks were trimmed and their oil replenished. This was not glamorous work. It required attention to detail, a willingness to wake in the darkness to check that the flames had not guttered out, an understanding that these small acts of maintenance were what kept the sacred space functioning. The lamps represented the presence of God, and Samuel learned that presence requires constant tending, constant attention, constant care. He cleaned the sacred vessels, swept the courts, washed the linens used in ceremonies, helped prepare the incense, carried water, ran errands. He memorized scriptures, learning to recite the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the tales of Moses and the Exodus, the laws given at Sinai. His education was entirely religious, entirely focused on service, entirely oriented towards something beyond himself. By all accounts, Samuel was a good child, humble, obedient, faithful in small things. The text tells us he grew in favour with both the Lord and with people. He was not resentful of his circumstances. He did not seem to chafe against the boundaries of his unusual childhood. Perhaps he had accepted that this was simply who he was, the boy who belonged to God, the boy who lived in the house of the Lord. But what must it have been like psychologically? To have no mother to comfort you when you woke from nightmares, to have no siblings to quarrel and play with, to grow up watching Eli's corrupt sons come and go, seeing the way they abused their position, hearing the whispers of their misconduct, to be surrounded by holiness and yet witness its corruption, to serve faithfully while those who should have been models of righteousness displayed only greed and lust and contempt for the sacred. Did Samuel wonder why he had been left here? Did he feel abandoned by the mother who had kissed him goodbye and walked away? Did he question whether the God he served even noticed his small acts of service? The text does not tell us. We see only the external facts, a boy growing up, performing his duties, learning his role. But surely there were moments of loneliness, moments of doubt, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy for small shoulders to carry. Hannah visited when she could. Each year during the family's annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, she would bring Samuel a new robe she'd made for him, watching him grow, trying to compress a year of mothering into a few brief encounters. These visits must have been both blessing and torment. The joy of seeing his mother mingled with the pain of watching her leave again. The new robe, a reminder that somewhere he had a home, a family, a life he was not permitted to live. Yet there is no indication that Samuel rebelled or resented his circumstances. He simply continued. Day after day, year after year, faithful in the small things, present in the sacred space, available to be used however God saw fit. There was no indication in those early years that he would become anything more than a helpful assistant to an aging priest, that he would one day be the voice through which God spoke to an entire nation. But God, it seems, has a habit of preparing his instruments in obscurity before bringing them into the light. Samuel was being shaped by his circumstances, formed by his loneliness, refined by his faithfulness in tasks that no one celebrated. He was learning what it meant to serve without applause, to be obedient without immediate reward, to remain present even when presence felt like punishment. He was learning to listen in the silence. Chapter 2. The State of Israel at the Time. To appreciate what happened on that quiet night when God called Samuel's name, you need to understand the spiritual condition of Israel during this period. It was, to put it simply, a disaster. But the disaster raises uncomfortable questions that the text never fully answers. Questions about divine silence. Questions about why systems of worship become corrupt. Questions about what happens when the mediators between heaven and earth become obstacles instead of conduits. The problem started with Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. These two men had inherited their father's position as priests, but they had not inherited his reverence for the sacred. They were corrupt in ways that went beyond simple moral failing. They actively perverted the worship of God, treating the sacrifices and offerings as opportunities for personal gain, turning the sacred into the profane with a systematic cruelty that suggests something darker than mere greed. When people brought animals to sacrifice at Shiloh, the priests were entitled to a specific portion of the meat according to the law of Moses. But Hophni and Phinehas were not content with their allotted share, with what had been designated as rightfully theirs. They wanted more. They wanted the best. They wanted what belonged to God. They would send their servants to threaten worshippers. demanding the choicest cuts of meat before the fat was even burned on the altar, as required by law. The fat belonged to God. That was non-negotiable in the sacrificial system. The burning of the fat was the moment when the sacrifice became truly sacred, when the offering transitioned from human gift to divine acceptance. But Hophni and Phinehas did not care about divine acceptance. They cared about their appetites. If people objected, if they tried to follow the proper procedures and insist that the fat be burned first, the servants would respond with threats of violence. We will take it by force if necessary. The priests were literally stealing from God, taking what belonged to the altar and consuming it themselves. They were turning worship into extortion, using their position of spiritual authority to exploit the vulnerable and the faithful. But their corruption went even darker, into territories that the text only hints at with uncomfortable brevity. They engaged in sexual immorality with women who served at the entrance to the sanctuary. These were women who had dedicated themselves to service at the tabernacle, who came to worship and serve with sincere devotion, and Hophni and Phinehas exploited them, used their authority and position to prey upon those who should have been under their protection. They turned the house of God into a place of exploitation and abuse, where the very people who were supposed to represent divine holiness became perpetrators of trauma. Worship became a source of fear rather than transcendence. People stopped coming, or when they came with cynicism and resentment, going through the motions but empty of faith. How could you trust a system where the gatekeepers were predators? How could you believe in the holiness of a place where the priests defiled it daily? The sanctuary at Shiloh, which was meant to be the central hub of Israel's spiritual life, became instead a monument to religious corruption. Eli knew what his sons were doing. The text makes this painfully clear. People told him. They came with reports of misconduct, of abuse, of exploitation. He heard the rumours and saw the evidence. He was not ignorant. He was not blind to their crimes. And to his credit, he confronted them. But his rebukes were weak, almost apologetic, carrying no weight and no consequence. Why do you do such things? I hear reports from the people about your wicked deeds. If someone sins against another person, God may mediate. But if someone sins against the Lord, who will intercede? The words acknowledge the problem but offer no solution. There is no threat of removal from office, no stripping of authority, no punishment that might actually deter the behaviour. Just words, just disappointment, just a father hoping his wayward sons might suddenly develop a conscience they had never demonstrated. Hophni and Phinehas ignored their father and continued their corruption. Why wouldn't they? There were no consequences. Eli's position as high priest gave him the authority to remove them, to appoint others, to enforce standards. But he did nothing, and his inaction was itself a form of action, a choice that enabled the continued degradation of worship. The impact on Israel's spiritual life was catastrophic. The text records it with devastating simplicity. The people came to despise the offerings to the Lord. Think about what that means. The sacrificial system was the heart of Israel's covenant relationship with God. It was how sins were atoned for, how gratitude was expressed, how the community maintained its connection with the divine. And people were learning to despise it, to see it as corrupt and meaningless, to associate worship with exploitation rather than with holiness. Faith withered. Cynicism spread. A generation was growing up believing that God either did not care about corruption in his own house, or that he was powerless to stop it, or worse, that he did not exist at all, and the whole system was simply a mechanism for priestly power and exploitation. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this era, the detail that haunts the narrative with its implications, was not the corruption of the priests. It was the silence of heaven. The scripture records it with haunting simplicity. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. Think about what that means. In a culture where prophets and priests were meant to be the conduits between God and humanity, the channel had gone quiet. God was not speaking. Or if he was, no one was hearing. Prophecies were scarce to the point of being legendary. Divine visions were so uncommon that when someone claimed to have received one, it was met with skepticism rather than expectation. But why? The text does not explain. It simply records the fact of divine silence as if it were weather, as if the absence of God's voice was as natural and unremarkable as a drought. But this raises uncomfortable questions. Had God withdrawn because of the corruption? Was the silence a form of judgment, a divine turning away from a people who had corrupted worship? Or had the people simply stopped listening? Had they become so cynical and so wounded by a religious hypocrisy that they could no longer hear what was being said? Or was there another possibility, one that the text does not explore but that hangs in the air like smoke? Perhaps the priests, who were supposed to be the mediators between God and people, had become such effective blockers of communication that divine messages simply could not get through. Perhaps Hophni and Phinehas were not just corrupt individuals, but symptoms of a systemic failure, a spiritual infrastructure that had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Israel was spiritually adrift, navigating by dead reckoning through waters where the stars had gone dark. There were no prophets to consult, no clear word from God about how to proceed, no divine guidance about which way to turn, just the daily grind of existence, the hollow rituals performed without meaning, the slow death of a people's faith in the face of institutional betrayal. This was the world into which Samuel was growing up, a world where the representatives of God were corrupt, where worship had become hollow, where heaven seemed distant and disinterested. If you were a young person in that era, what would you believe about the divine? Would you expect God to speak? Would you even know what his voice sounded like? Would you be able to distinguish a divine call from your own imagination or from the voice of a very human priest? Samuel cleaned the lamps each evening, ensuring the light would burn through the night. It was a practical task, a maintenance duty, nothing spiritual about it. He trimmed the wicks, refilled the oil reservoirs, ensured the flames were steady. But in that small act, there was a symbol that perhaps Samuel himself did not fully understand. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Somewhere in the darkness a light still burned, and into that darkness, cutting through the silence that had lasted for generations, a voice was about to break through. Chapter 3. The night God spoke. The night began like any other. Samuel had completed his duties for the day, working through the familiar routines that structured his life. The sanctuary was clean, the floors swept, the vessels washed and arranged in their proper places. The lamps were lit, their flames steady, casting dancing shadows across the ancient stones. The sacred space was prepared for the silence of the evening hours, for the long watch through darkness toward dawn. Eli, now elderly and nearly blind, his eyes grown dim from age and perhaps from seeing too much corruption without acting, had retired to his usual place. He moved slowly now, carefully, feeling his way along walls he had walked beside for decades. His sleeping area was separate but nearby, close enough that Samuel could hear him if he called, out in the night. Samuel lay down in his customary sleeping spot somewhere near the chamber where the Ark of the Covenant rested. The exact location is not specified in the text, but the implication is clear. He slept in proximity to the most sacred object in all of Israel, closer to the physical representation of God's presence than anyone else in the nation that night. The Ark was the most sacred object in Israel, a gold-covered chest containing the tablets of the law, the jar of manna, and Aaron's staff that had budded. But more than its contents, the Ark represented the very presence of God among his people. It was the throne of the invisible King, the place where heaven touched earth, the point of contact between the divine and the mortal. To sleep near it was to sleep in the shadow of holiness, though Samuel likely thought nothing of it. This was simply where he slept, as ordinary to him as any bedroom, as familiar as his own breathing. The lamp of God was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. This detail matters more than it might initially seem. In the Jewish tradition, the lamp in the sanctuary, the menorah that burned with consecrated oil, was not allowed to go out until morning light made it unnecessary. It represented the presence of God, the light that persisted even in darkness, the hope that had not yet been extinguished. The phrase, "the lamp of God had not yet gone out," carries within it both promise and warning. Not yet, but it could. The light was still burning, but barely. The presence was still there, but fading. As long as the lamp burned, there was hope. As long as the light persisted against the encroaching darkness, God had not abandoned his dwelling place entirely. Samuel drifted into sleep, a boy exhausted from the honest labour of serving in the house of God. His breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed. He sank into that deep, dreamless sleep that comes from physical work and a clear conscience. The sanctuary around him settled into its nighttime sounds. The creak of cooling stone, the whisper of wind through high windows, the distant cry of a night bird, the soft flutter of the lamp flames, and then, in the darkness, cutting through the silence like a knife through cloth, he heard his name, Samuel. The voice was clear, distinct, personal. Not a shout that would echo through the halls, but not a whisper that could be mistaken for imagination either. It had the quality of someone standing nearby, speaking with intention and purpose, with the certainty that they would be heard. It was a voice that expected a response. Samuel's eyes snapped open. His heart leaped in his chest. There was no confusion, no moment of disorientation. He knew immediately that someone had called him. The voice had been too clear, too deliberate, too unmistakably directed at him. In the darkness, with the lamp casting its uncertain light, Samuel did what made perfect sense to a boy who had grown up serving under an elderly priest. Eli must need something. The old priest was nearly blind now, stumbling in the darkness. Perhaps he had dropped something. Perhaps he needed water. Perhaps he was unwell and required assistance. Samuel threw off whatever covering he used against the night chill and ran to where Eli slept. "Here I am. You called me?" The response was immediate, instinctive. "Here I am." Two words that would become the defining posture of Samuel's entire life. Not, "What do you want?" Not, "Can it wait until morning?" Just presence. Just availability. Here I am. Eli, pulled from sleep and confused, his mind foggy with the remnants of dreams, looked in the direction of Samuel's voice with eyes that could barely make out shapes in the darkness. "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Samuel returned to his place, perhaps a little puzzled, but not overly concerned. Perhaps he had been dreaming. Perhaps the transition from sleep to waking had jumbled his perceptions. Perhaps the old man had called out in his sleep and forgotten. These things happen. The mind plays tricks in the boundary spaces between consciousness and unconsciousness. He lay back down, pulled his covering around him, and closed his eyes, willing himself back towards sleep. The sanctuary settled back into silence. The lamp continued its steady burning. Outside, the wind moved through the hills with a sound like breathing. Samuel's heartbeat slowed back to its resting rhythm. Samuel? Again. The same voice, the same clarity, the same undeniable sense that someone was speaking directly to him, calling him by name with purpose and intention. This was not imagination. This was not the remnant of a dream clinging to the edge of waking. This was not the echo of Eli's voice misheard in the darkness. Someone had called his name, clearly and deliberately, as real as the stone beneath him and the lamplight flickering against the walls. Once more, Samuel got up and went to Eli. His bare feet made soft sounds against the cold stone floor. His breathing was quicker now, his confusion deeper. If Eli had not called the first time, then who had? "Here I am. You called me." Eli, now more awake and perhaps slightly irritated at being disturbed a second time, sent him away again with a tone that suggested both confusion and mild frustration. "I did not call, my son. Go back and lie down." Samuel returned, but now there was a question forming in his mind that would not be silenced. If Eli was not calling him, then who was? Was someone playing a trick? Was there an intruder in the sanctuary hiding in the shadows, calling his name for some unknown purpose? But the voice had not seemed mischievous or threatening. It had been steady, certain, intimate, the kind of voice that knows you, that has the right to call your name. He lay back down, but this time sleep did not come easily. His eyes stayed open, staring into the darkness above him. His ears strained for any sound, any indication of who or what had spoken to him. The lamp flickered. A moth circled near its flame. Time stretched and compressed in that strange way it does when you are lying awake in the dark, unsure whether minutes or hours are passing. Samuel. The third time, Samuel abandoned any doubt or hesitation. Someone was calling him, and if it was not Eli, then perhaps the old priest was confused. Perhaps he was calling out without realizing it. Perhaps his dreams were speaking through him. Samuel got up once more, faster now, urgent, and went to Eli. He stood at the foot of the old priest's sleeping mat, his young face barely visible in the dim light that filtered in from the main chamber. "Here I am. You called me." And finally, after decades of serving in the sanctuary, after years of watching the word of the Lord become rare and vision scarce, after witnessing the corruption of his sons and the slow death of Israel's faith, Eli understood. The realization must have hit him like a physical blow. God was calling the boy, not the high priest, not the experienced religious leader, not the man who had served in this place for decades. The boy who cleaned the floors and tended the lamps and slept near the ark without fully comprehending what that meant. Eli's response is one of the most beautiful moments in the entire narrative. He could have been jealous, wounded by the divine bypassing, bitter that his years of service were being overlooked in favour of a child. He could have been defensive, questioning whether this was really happening, whether Samuel was perhaps confused or making things up. He could have claimed the voice for himself, insisted that any divine communication should come through proper channels, through the established hierarchy of priesthood. But instead, Eli became a teacher in the truest sense. He gave Samuel the gift of understanding and the words that would change everything. He put aside whatever personal feelings he might have had, and focused entirely on helping Samuel navigate what was about to happen. "Go and lie down," Eli said, and you can hear in those words both resignation and hope, both the sadness of being passed over and the wonder that God was speaking again at all. And if he calls you, say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Those words, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," not "Who are you?" Not "What do you want?" Not "Prove yourself to me." Just openness, just availability, just the humble acknowledgement that if God is speaking, the only appropriate response is to listen. Samuel returned to his place one more time. He lay down in the darkness, the lamp of God still burning nearby, casting its uncertain light across ancient stones, and he waited. His heart must have been pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His mind must have been racing with questions and fears and wonder. What does the voice of God sound like? What will he say? Am I worthy to hear it? What if I do not understand? What if I get it wrong? The silence stretched. The lamp flickered. Outside, the night continued its slow progression toward dawn. And then, for the fourth time, the voice came. But this time there was a difference. This time the name was repeated, spoken twice, with an intimacy and urgency that had not been there before. "Samuel! Samuel!" The repetition is significant. In Hebrew, when a name is called twice, it indicates intimacy, urgency, importance. Abraham, Abraham, Moses, Moses. Now Samuel, Samuel. This was not a casual summons. This was personal, direct, unmistakable. This time, the boy was ready. Following Eli's instructions exactly, word for word, he responded with the words that have echoed through millennia as the perfect posture of faith, the ideal response to divine initiative. "Speak, for your servant is listening." And God spoke. What happened next was not what a child would want to hear. God did not give Samuel a message of encouragement or blessing. He did not reveal some beautiful mystery or share some cosmic secret about the nature of reality or the structure of heaven. He did not offer comfort or promise Samuel a glorious future. Instead, God gave Samuel a prophecy of judgment, and the judgment was against Eli's household, against the man who had been like a father to him, against the only family he had truly known. God told Samuel that he was about to do something in Israel that would make the ears of everyone who heard it tingle. That phrase, ears tingling, suggests something shocking, something that would reverberate through the nation like a physical sensation. This was not going to be a quiet judgment, a private correction. This was going to be public, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. He was going to carry out against Eli everything he had spoken concerning his family, from beginning to end. There had been warnings before. A prophet had come to Eli years earlier with a similar message, speaking of judgment to come, of the priesthood being taken from his lineage, of his sons dying on the same day. That prophecy had been spoken and then seemingly forgotten, filed away as one of those uncomfortable truths that people acknowledge but never really expect to see fulfilled. But God was saying now that the time of fulfillment had come. The warnings were over. The judgment was at hand. The reason was clear and devastating. Eli knew about the sins of his sons. He knew they were blaspheming God, treating the sacred as profane, exploiting women, stealing from the altar, corrupting worship itself. He had heard the reports. He had seen the evidence. He had confronted them, yes, but his rebukes were empty, carrying no weight, leading to no consequences. He had failed to restrain them, failed to use his authority to stop them, failed to choose God's honour over his son's comfort, and that failure, that complicity through inaction, meant that the guilt of Eli's house would never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Think about what that means. In a religious system built entirely around sacrifice and atonement, where every sin could theoretically be covered by the blood of animals and the proper rituals, God was declaring that some corruption runs too deep for ritual to reach. Some betrayals are so fundamental that the system itself cannot address them. Eli's family would carry their guilt to the grave and beyond, marked forever by their choice to prioritize family loyalty over divine justice. Imagine being Samuel in that moment. You are a child, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, lying in the darkness of a sanctuary, having just heard the voice of God for the first time in your life. And the message you have been given is not one of blessing or calling or future glory. It is a message of doom for the man who has raised you, who has taught you everything you know about worship and service, who has been your only father figure in a life marked by abandonment and loneliness. The weight of it must have been crushing. How do you speak words of judgment to someone you love? How do you become the bearer of bad news that will break someone's heart? How do you look into the eyes of a man who has shown you kindness and tell him that his family line is cursed, that his sons will die, that everything he has built will crumble? This was the cost of prophecy that no one talks about. This was the burden of truth that cannot be softened or avoided or delayed. Samuel had been given a message, and whether he wanted to deliver it or not was irrelevant. The truth had been spoken to him, and now he was responsible for speaking it to others. This is what it means to be a prophet. Not visions and mystical experiences and spiritual heights, but the grinding, awful responsibility of speaking truths that wound you as deeply as they wound those who hear them. The rest of the night must have been agony for Samuel. The text tells us he lay there until dawn, too afraid to tell Eli what he'd heard. He did not sleep. How could he? His mind must have raced through possibilities. Maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe there was a way to soften the message to make it less harsh. Maybe if he just kept quiet, the whole thing would fade like a dream, and he could go back to his simple life of tending lamps and sweeping floors. But deep down, he knew. The voice had been too clear. The message had been too specific. And God had not asked his opinion about whether this was a good idea or whether Samuel felt ready for such responsibility. The divine does not consult us about our readiness. It simply calls, and we must answer. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Message. As morning light began to filter into the sanctuary, pale and hesitant through the high windows, Samuel rose and went about his duties as usual. Muscle memory guided him through the familiar routines. He opened the doors of the house of the Lord, pushing aside the heavy wooden barriers that sealed the sacred from the profane, letting in the day. with all its ordinary demands. But everything felt different now. The air was heavier, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. The silence was louder, filled with the words he carried but could not speak. He carried within him words that would change everything, and he was terrified to voice them. His hands shook as he performed his tasks. He fumbled with the lamp wicks, nearly spilling oil on the floor. He could not meet anyone's eyes. Every sound made him jump, expecting Eli to call for him, to demand the message, to force him to speak the unspeakable. Eli, however, knew something had happened. Years of serving in the sanctuary had given him an intuition about spiritual matters that his failing eyesight could not diminish. He could sense the change in Samuel, could feel the weight the boy was carrying. He called Samuel to him, his voice gentle but insistent, and when the boy came, reluctant and pale, the old priest asked him directly, "Samuel, my son, what was it he said to you? Please do not hide it from me." Then he added words that carried the weight of both authority and desperation. "May God deal with you, be it ever so severely if you hide from me anything he told you." It was an oath, a binding formula that made concealment impossible. Eli was not giving Samuel an easy out. He was demanding truth, however painful, however devastating. And in doing so, he was teaching Samuel one of the most important lessons of prophetic ministry: that truth matters more than comfort, that integrity requires speaking even when silence would be kinder. There is something deeply moving about this moment. Eli was giving Samuel permission to speak truth, even painful truth. He was not demanding a comfortable answer. He was not pressuring the boy to lie or soften the message. He was not using his position as high priest to intimidate or manipulate. He was simply asking for honesty, for the faithful delivery of whatever word had been given, regardless of personal cost. Samuel, to his credit, did not hold back. He told Eli everything, every word of the judgment, every detail of the coming consequences, every aspect of the doom pronounced against his house. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not try to make it easier to hear. He did not add comforting caveats or suggest ways the judgment might be avoided. He simply delivered the message as it had been given to him, faithful to both God and to Eli in his refusal to distort the truth. The words must have felt like stones in his mouth, each one heavy and sharp. He would have watched Eli's face as he spoke, looking for signs of anger or rejection or denial. But what he saw instead was something he had not expected. Eli's response is remarkable in its humility and resignation. He did not rage against the pronouncement. He did not question Samuel's experience or suggest the boy had misunderstood or imagined things. He did not blame Samuel for being the messenger or accuse him of disloyalty or ingratitude. He simply said, with a weariness that spoke of years of knowing this moment would come, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." There is defeat in those words, yes, but there is also acceptance, a kind of peace that comes from finally having the truth spoken aloud, from no longer living in the shadow of unacknowledged reality. Eli had known for years that his sons were corrupt. He had known that his failure to stop them was a kind of complicity, a betrayal of his calling and his God. The judgment was not a surprise. It was an inevitability finally spoken aloud, a truth that had been hovering unspoken in the air for years finally given voice and substance. And perhaps in some way, Eli was relieved that the silence had been broken, even if the words spoken were words of judgment. Perhaps there is a relief that comes from knowing, from having certainty, even when that certainty is terrible. Perhaps after years of wondering when the hammer would fall, there was a strange comfort in finally hearing it fall, in knowing the shape of the future even when that future was dark. What Samuel learned that night and that morning was something most of us spend a lifetime avoiding. That truth is not always comfortable, that faithfulness sometimes means delivering hard words, and that love does not require us to hide reality from those we care about. Samuel could have lied to Eli. He could have softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details, or suggested that perhaps he had misunderstood what God was saying, but he chose honesty, and in doing so he established the pattern that would define his entire ministry. He would be a prophet who spoke the word of the Lord without compromise, without concern for how it would be received, without fear of the consequences. Not because he was harsh or unfeeling, but because he understood that truth, however painful, is ultimately an act of respect. To lie to someone, even to spare their feelings, is to treat them as less than fully human, as incapable of bearing reality. Samuel gave Eli the dignity of truth, and Eli received it with the dignity of acceptance. Chapter 5. Samuel becomes a prophet. After that night, everything changed for Samuel. The text tells us that he grew, and the Lord was with him, letting none of his words fall to the ground. That phrase, letting none of his words fall to the ground, is the ancient way of saying that everything Samuel prophesied came true. He was not speaking his own opinions or making educated guesses or offering the kind of vague predictions that could be interpreted multiple ways, depending on how events unfolded. He was speaking with divine authority, and reality itself confirmed his words with uncomfortable precision. The prophecy about Eli's house came true exactly as Samuel had spoken it. The details are grim and worth recounting because they establish Samuel's credibility as a true prophet in a time when false prophets were common and people had grown cynical about divine communication. Israel went to war against the Philistines, their perennial enemy. In the first battle, the Israelites were defeated and thousands of soldiers died. In desperation, the elders decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to the battlefield, believing that God's physical presence would guarantee victory. Hophni and Phinehas accompanied the Ark, treating it like a magical talisman rather than the throne of the living God. The Israelites shouted when the Ark arrived, a roar so loud that the ground shook. The Philistines were terrified at first, knowing the stories of what the God of Israel had done to Egypt. But they fought anyway, and in the battle that followed, Israel was utterly defeated. 30,000 soldiers died, and on that same day, exactly as prophesied, both Hophni and Phinehas were killed. The Ark of God was captured by the Philistines, carried off as a trophy of war. When a messenger brought the news to Shiloh, Eli was sitting by the road, his heart trembling for the Ark of God. When he heard that the Ark had been captured and his sons were dead, the 98-year-old priest fell backward off his chair, broke his neck, and died. The priesthood of his line ended in that moment, cut off exactly as God had declared. It was a devastating fulfillment, but it established beyond doubt that Samuel spoke with divine authority. He had predicted these events when he was just a child, and they had come to pass exactly as he said. The word of the Lord through Samuel was reliable, trustworthy, deserving of attention. As Samuel matured from boy to young man, his reputation spread throughout Israel like wildfire. From Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the deep south, spanning the entire geographical extent of Israel's territory, everyone knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord. The word that had been rare, the visions that had been scarce, now flowed through this young man who had learned to listen in the darkness. But Samuel was more than just a prophet delivering occasional messages. God continued to appear at Shiloh, revealing himself to Samuel through his word on a regular basis. Samuel became the primary channel of divine communication for the entire nation. The silence had been broken. The channel between heaven and earth, clogged by corruption and complacency for generations, had been cleared. And the instrument God chose was not a powerful warrior or a cunning politician or even an experienced priest with decades of religious training. It was a boy who had learned to say 5 simple words: "Speak, for your servant is listening." Samuel's influence on Israel cannot be overstated. He became the bridge between the chaotic era of the judges and the establishment of the monarchy, standing at one of the most critical transitions in the nation's history. He was the last judge, travelling on a circuit through Bethel, Gilgal and Mizpah, settling disputes and administering justice with a wisdom that people recognised as coming from God. He was also the first of the great prophets, the founder of a prophetic tradition that would produce Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all the voices that would call Israel back to God throughout its history. When the people demanded a king like the surrounding nations, it was Samuel who anointed Saul, a tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin, as Israel's first king. And when Saul proved disobedient and unfaithful to God, it was Samuel who had to deliver yet another hard message of judgment, who had to watch another man he had elevated fall under divine displeasure. Later, it was Samuel who anointed David, the younger son of Jesse, a shepherd boy with no apparent qualifications except that God had chosen him. That shepherd boy would become Israel's greatest king, the man whose lineage would eventually produce the Messiah. But beyond the political role, beyond the anointing of kings and the settling of disputes, Samuel represented something Israel desperately needed: spiritual integrity in a world corroded by compromise. In a time when the priesthood had become corrupt, when worship had become hollow, when the word of the Lord was rare, Samuel embodied what it meant to hear from God and speak his truth faithfully regardless of personal cost. He reformed religious life throughout Israel, establishing schools of prophets where young men could learn to listen for God's voice and speak his word. He called the people back to authentic worship, challenging them to put away their foreign gods and serve the Lord only. He led the nation in repentance at Mizpah, where they fasted and confessed their sins, acknowledging that they had abandoned God. And when the Philistines attacked during that gathering, Samuel interceded for the people, and God threw the enemy into confusion with thunder and lightning, giving Israel a decisive victory. Samuel demonstrated that God had not abandoned his people, that the silence had been circumstantial rather than permanent, that divine presence and power was still available to those who would seek them with integrity. The boy who once cleaned floors and trimmed lamp wicks became the conscience of a nation. The child who slept near the ark became the voice through which God spoke to kings and commoners alike. His authority came not from position, or political power, or military might, but from the simple fact that he had learned to listen and had the courage to speak what he heard, even when speaking cost him dearly. Chapter 6. The Legacy of the Story. So what do we take from this ancient narrative? What does it mean for us, centuries removed from oil lamps and tabernacles and sleeping near the Ark of the Covenant? And perhaps more intriguingly, what questions does this story raise that it never fully answers? First, there is the theme of listening. God can speak in quiet places, in ordinary moments, when we least expect it. Samuel was not performing some elaborate spiritual ritual when God called his name. He was not fasting on a mountain. He was not in a trance or a vision quest. He was sleeping, exhausted from a day of mundane labour. He was simply present in a sacred space, available to be awakened. How often do we miss the voice of the divine because we are too busy, too distracted, too convinced that revelation only comes in spectacular packages? We wait for burning bushes and angelic visitations, for dramatic signs and unmistakable interventions, while the still small voice speaks in the darkness and we mistake it for our imagination, or for human conversation, or for nothing at all. Samuel teaches us that sometimes the most profound moments arrive softly, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the darkness when our defences are down and our minds are quiet enough to hear what has always been speaking. But this raises uncomfortable questions. How many times has that voice spoken and we have ignored it? How many times have we attributed divine communication to coincidence or psychology or wish fulfillment? Because we have lost the ability to recognize it for what it is. Second, there is the theme of obedience. Samuel's first response when he heard his name was immediate and complete. Here I am. No hesitation, no calculation, no weighing of options or considering whether this was a good time, just presence and availability. Not, what do you want, but here I am. Not, let me think about it, but immediate response. Later, when Eli gave him the words to use, Samuel followed the instruction exactly. He did not improvise or try to improve on the formula or insert his own personality into the exchange. He simply said what he had been taught to say: "Speak, for your servant is listening." Obedience in this story is not about blind submission to authority. It is about being teachable, about recognizing when someone knows more than you do. about trusting guidance even when you do not fully understand where it is leading. But there is something deeper here, something that troubles the waters of easy interpretation. Samuel was obedient to a voice he had never heard before, to a presence he could not see, based entirely on the instruction of a priest whose own family was corrupt, and whose judgment had been compromised by his failure to discipline his sons. What made Samuel so certain that this was God speaking and not some other voice? What internal compass guided him toward trust when skepticism would have been equally reasonable? Third, there is the theme of humility. Samuel's greatness began in small acts of service. He was faithful in opening doors, in cleaning, in tending lamps, in all the unglamorous work that keeps a sacred space functioning. He did not despise the small things, or consider himself above menial tasks. He swept floors with the same attention he later brought to anointing kings. He trimmed lamp wicks with the same care he would later exercise in delivering prophetic words, and it was in that posture of humble service, in the daily repetition of small faithful acts, that God found him. How different this is from our modern obsession with platform and visibility, with making a name for ourselves and ensuring everyone knows our accomplishments, with treating service as a stepping stone to something better rather than as its own reward. Samuel reminds us that true influence is built in obscurity, that character is formed in the small decisions no one sees, that greatness is the fruit of faithfulness in little things rather than the result of ambitious self-promotion. But again, there is a mystery here. Why Samuel? What was it about this particular boy that made him suitable for this calling? The text gives no indication that he was exceptional in any way. He was simply there, simply faithful, simply available. Which raises the question, are there others who are equally faithful, equally available, who never heard their name called? Is divine calling arbitrary, or is there some hidden criteria that determines who hears the voice and who does not? Fourth, there is the theme of responsibility. Sometimes truth is hard but necessary. Samuel's first message from God was a message of judgment, and he had to deliver it to someone he loved. This is the cost of being a conduit for truth. You do not get to choose which messages are convenient and which are difficult. You do not get to edit reality to make it more palatable. You do not get to withhold hard truths, because speaking them might damage relationships or cost you social capital. If you are going to be a voice for something beyond yourself, whether you call that voice God or conscience or truth, or simply what is, you have to be willing to speak even when the words cut you as deeply as they cut those who hear them. Samuel could have spared Eli. He could have lied or softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details. But he chose the harder path of honesty, and in doing so he honoured both Eli and himself. Yet this raises ethical questions that the narrative does not resolve. What is the balance between truth and compassion? When does speaking hard truths become cruelty disguised as honesty? Samuel was a child delivering a message he did not create and could not change. But what about us? When the truths we must speak are filtered through our own perceptions and biases and limited understanding, how do we know when to speak and when to remain silent? Fifth, there is the theme of hope. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Even in the darkest period of Israel's spiritual life, when the priesthood was corrupt and the word of the Lord was rare and the nation was spiritually adrift, there was still a light burning somewhere in the darkness. God had not abandoned his people. He was simply waiting for someone who would listen, someone who would respond, someone who would be faithful with what was given to them. Samuel represents the truth that it is never too late for renewal, that no matter how far things have fallen, no matter how corrupt the systems or how cynical the people, there is always the possibility of a voice in the darkness calling us back to what matters. The light may be flickering, the wick may be nearly consumed, the oil may be running low, but as long as there is any light at all, there is hope for rekindling, for replenishment, for the dawn that follows even the longest night. But this optimistic reading sits uncomfortably with the historical reality. The lamp did eventually go out. The sanctuary at Shiloh was destroyed. The ark was captured and never returned to that place. The line of Eli ended in blood and disgrace. Samuel's calling did not prevent disaster, it only narrated it before it happened. So what kind of a hope is this? Is it simply the hope that truth will be spoken, even if it changes nothing? Is it the hope that someone will bear witness, even in the midst of collapse? Finally, there is something unspoken in this narrative that deserves attention. God bypassed the entire religious hierarchy to speak to a child. He did not go through official channels. He did not honour the established order. He did not consult with the high priest or seek permission from religious authorities. He simply called out in the darkness to a boy who had no status, no authority, no credentials beyond faithfulness in small things. This is either deeply encouraging or deeply unsettling, depending on your perspective. It suggests that divine communication is not controlled by institutions, that truth can emerge from the margins, that the voice of God might speak to those we least expect, rather than to those we've designated as official intermediaries. But it also raises anarchistic questions about authority and order, about how we distinguish genuine divine calling from delusion or manipulation, about what happens when everyone claims to hear the voice of God speaking contradictory messages. Samuel's story is ultimately about availability. He was not the most powerful person in Israel. He was not the most educated or the most connected. He was simply present, attentive, and willing to respond when he heard his name called. And that was enough. That has always been enough. But it invites us to ask, what are we available for? What sacred spaces do we inhabit, whether physical or spiritual or psychological, where we might be found by whatever calls to us in the darkness? And when that call comes, will we recognize it, or will we mistake it for something ordinary, something explainable, something that requires no response? Epilogue: The Voice in the Night. Close your eyes and imagine that sanctuary again. The vast stone building in Shiloh, the oil lamps casting their gentle light, the shadows dancing on walls that have witnessed generations of worship and neglect. Imagine the boy lying near the ark, exhausted from a day of simple service, drifting into sleep with no expectation that this night will be different from any other. And then the voice, clear, personal, undeniable, a voice that breaks through the silence of heaven and calls a child by name. Samuel's story is a reminder that the divine does not always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes as a whisper in the darkness. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a question repeated until we finally understand that we are being addressed. Sometimes the most significant moments of our lives happen when we are alone, unguarded, simply present in a space where we have made ourselves available to something greater than ourselves. The lamp of God is still burning. That is the promise embedded in this ancient narrative. No matter how dark the times, no matter how corrupt the systems, no matter how silent heaven seems, there is always a light somewhere refusing to go out, and there is always the possibility that in the quiet, in the stillness, in the spaces between our busy thoughts and desperate prayers, we might hear our name spoken by a voice we do not yet recognize. The question is not whether the voice is calling. The question is whether we are listening. Samuel lay in that sanctuary as a boy and became a prophet because he learned to say 5 words that changed everything. Speak, for your servant is listening. He did not demand proof. He did not negotiate terms. He did not insist on understanding everything before committing to anything. He simply made himself available, and availability was enough. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Samuel's calling. Not that he became powerful or influential or historically significant, though he became all those things. The real legacy is that he teaches us what it looks like to be genuinely open to transformation, to be willing to hear hard truths, to be faithful in small things while waiting for larger purposes to reveal themselves. In our age of constant noise and perpetual distraction, where silence is something to be feared rather than cherished, Samuel's story feels almost subversive. It suggests that the most important communications might not come through our devices or our carefully curated information streams. They might come in the quiet, in the dark, in the moments when we stop performing and simply exist in the presence of something that knows our name. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, Consider the possibility that you, too, might be lying in a sacred space, even if you do not recognize it as such. Consider the possibility that there might be a voice, gentle and persistent, calling your name in the darkness. Consider the possibility that the most profound transformation of your life might not begin with a grand revelation or a spectacular sign, but with the simple decision to respond to that voice with 5 words. Speak, for your servant is listening. The lamp is still burning. The voice is still calling. The only question is whether we have ears to hear. True faith is not proven in comfort, but in pressure. It's easy to worship when worship is celebrated, easy to pray when prayer is protected, easy to believe when belief comes with applause and approval. But what happens when faith is met with silence, with suspicion, with punishment? The story of Daniel is not just ancient history, it's a mirror, a question posed across millennia. What do you do when faithfulness becomes dangerous? This is a story set in a foreign empire, under unfamiliar laws, where quiet personal devotion drew the attention of the most powerful men in the world, where remaining faithful meant risking everything, where one man's refusal to hide his prayers would lead him into a den of lions and reveal something far greater than survival. It's a story about what faith looks like when tested, not by doubt, but by decree. Faith is often misunderstood. People imagine it as a feeling, a warm certainty that everything will work out, a guarantee of protection, a shield against suffering. But that's not what faith is. Not really. Faith is what remains when the feelings fade, when the guarantees disappear, when the shield is stripped away and all that's left is a choice. Will you still believe? Will you still obey? Will you still pray? Daniel's story forces us to confront that question, because his faith wasn't tested in a moment of spiritual ecstasy. It was tested in the cold machinery of political power, in the ruthless calculations of ambitious men, in a law that made devotion a capital offence. And yet, he prayed. Not because he was foolish, not because he didn't understand the danger, but because he understood something deeper, something that transcends empires and edicts and even lions. He understood that faithfulness is not measured by outcomes, it's measured by obedience, and that the God he served was worthy of trust, even when trust looked like walking into death. This is the story of a man who would not bend, and the God who would not abandon him. Chapter 1. A captive who rose to honour. Daniel was not born in Babylon. He was taken there. As a young man, he had been torn from Jerusalem during the conquest of Judah. The Babylonian Empire had swept through his homeland like a storm, crushing resistance, sacking the temple, and carrying away the brightest and best of Israel's youth. Daniel was among them, young, educated, from a noble family. He was dragged into captivity not as a criminal, but as a prize. The year was around 605 before the Common Era. King Nebuchadnezzar had laid siege to Jerusalem, and the city had fallen. The treasures of the temple were plundered. The sacred vessels were carried off to the house of Nebuchadnezzar's gods. And the young men of noble birth were selected for a different kind of conquest, cultural assimilation. Daniel and his companions were to be educated in the language and literature of the Babylonians. They were to eat the king's food, drink the king's wine, and be transformed into servants of a pagan empire. The goal was clear: strip away their identity, replace their loyalty, and turn them into Babylonians. But exile did not break Daniel. It refined him. From the very beginning he made choices, small choices that revealed the depth of his character. When offered the king's rich food and wine, Daniel politely refused, not out of ingratitude, but out of faithfulness. The food had been offered to idols. To consume it would be to participate, even indirectly, in pagan worship. So Daniel requested vegetables and water instead. It was a small act of defiance, quiet, respectful, but unmistakable, and God honoured it. Daniel and his friends thrived on their simple diet. They grew stronger, healthier, wiser than all the other young men in the king's service. This became Daniel's pattern. While others adapted by abandoning their heritage, Daniel held on. While some forgot the God of their fathers, Daniel remembered. In a foreign land, under foreign rule, surrounded by foreign gods, Daniel remained faithful. And that faithfulness, paradoxically, became his greatest strength. He was educated in the ways of Babylon. He learned their language, their literature, their customs. He mastered astronomy, mathematics, law, and administration. He became fluent in the complex bureaucracy of empire. He understood how power worked, how decisions were made, how kingdoms rose and fell. But he never forgot who he was. He never forgot where he came from. And he never forgot the God who had called his people out of Egypt, led them through the wilderness, and established them in the promised land. Even though that land was now under occupation, even though the temple was destroyed, even though his people were scattered, Daniel served in the court of kings, and he did so with such wisdom, such integrity, such undeniable excellence that even pagan rulers could not ignore him. When King Nebuchadnezzar had troubling dreams, it was Daniel who interpreted them. When the king saw a mysterious hand writing on the wall during a feast, it was Daniel who read the message and explained its meaning. When rulers needed counsel, they turned to Daniel. Not because he was politically cunning, but because he was honest. Not because he told them what they wanted to hear, but because he told them the truth. King Nebuchadnezzar had trusted him. King Belshazzar had summoned him in desperation. And now, under the rule of the Medes and Persians, Daniel continued to serve. Decades had passed since his capture. His hair had greyed. His body had aged. He had outlived kings, outlasted empires, survived revolutions, but his spirit, his devotion to God, remained as sharp as ever. He was not a priest. He was not a prophet in the traditional sense. He was a government official, an administrator, a man who handled budgets, policies, and politics, a man who navigated the treacherous waters of imperial bureaucracy. And yet, in the middle of that secular world, his faith never wavered. He prayed 3 times a day, every day, windows open, facing Jerusalem, kneeling before the God who had never abandoned him, even in exile. It was a discipline he had maintained for decades, in youth and in old age, in favour and in obscurity, in safety and in danger. Prayer was not something Daniel did when he felt like it. It was not a hobby or a habit he picked up when convenient. It was the rhythm of his life, the foundation of his identity, the source of his strength. Every morning, every afternoon, every evening, Daniel would stop whatever he was doing, go to his room, open the windows toward Jerusalem and pray. He thanked God for his faithfulness. He asked for wisdom. He interceded for his people. He worshipped. He remembered. And it was this discipline, this quiet, consistent devotion that would soon place him in the crosshairs of envy. Because in the palace, Daniel was not alone. He was surrounded by officials, administrators, governors, and nobles. Men who had been born into privilege, men who had wealth, status, and connections. Men who understood how the game of power was played, and they were about to discover that Daniel was unbeatable, not because he played the game better than them, but because he refused to play it at all. Chapter 2. The New King's Favour. When Darius the Mede took control of Babylon, the empire was in transition. The Babylonian dynasty had fallen. The night of Belshazzar's feast, the night of the writing on the wall, had ended with conquest. The armies of the Medes and Persians had entered the city, and the throne had changed hands. Darius was a strategic king. He understood that ruling a vast empire required more than military might. It required organisation, delegation, oversight, and most of all, trust. The Persian Empire was enormous. It stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing dozens of nations, languages and cultures. Governing such a territory required a sophisticated administrative structure. So Darius restructured the government. He divided the empire into provinces, each overseen by a satrap, a regional governor with significant authority. He appointed 120 satraps to rule over different regions. But to keep them accountable, to prevent corruption and rebellion, Darius placed 3 high officials above them. These 3 would oversee the satraps, report directly to the king, and ensure that the empire ran smoothly. And among those 3, Daniel stood out. It wasn't favoritism, it was merit. Daniel had proven himself time and again across multiple administrations under multiple kings. His decisions were sound, his judgment was clear, his integrity was unshakable. He didn't scheme for power, he didn't play favourites, he didn't take bribes or bend the truth to suit political wins. While others manoeuvred and manipulated, Daniel simply worked. Faithfully, excellently, without compromise, King Darius noticed. In meetings, Daniel's counsel was the most reliable. In crises, Daniel's solutions were the most effective. In disputes, Daniel's judgments were the most fair. There was a steadiness about him, a wisdom that transcended political calculation, an honesty that made him trustworthy even in a world built on deception. Darius began to consider something bold, elevating Daniel above all the other officials, making him second only to the king himself, giving him authority over the entire empire. It was an extraordinary honour. A Hebrew exile rising to the highest position in a Persian empire. A foreigner trusted above native-born nobles. A man in his 80s being given more power than men half his age. A worshipper of the God of Israel being placed over men who bowed to Ahura Mazda and a pantheon of other deities. It was unprecedented, and it was dangerous, because honour has a shadow, and that shadow is envy. The other officials watched Daniel's rise with growing resentment. They saw the king's favour. They saw Daniel's influence. They saw the way Darius consulted him, trusted him, relied on him, and they hated it. Not because Daniel was corrupt, but because he wasn't. Not because he played political games, but because he refused to. Not because he was incompetent, but because his competence made them look inadequate by comparison. They were men of status, wealth, and power. They had spent their lives climbing the ladder of influence. They had made the right alliances, said the right things, positioned themselves strategically. And now this foreigner, this exile, this old man who refused to compromise, was about to be elevated above them all. It was intolerable. So they began to plot, quietly at first, carefully. They met in private, away from the king's hearing. They shared their grievances, fueled each other's resentment, and began to strategize. Their goal was clear: destroy Daniel, remove him from power, eliminate the threat he posed to their ambitions. But how? Daniel was beyond reproach. He didn't make mistakes. He didn't break rules. He didn't have skeletons in his closet. There was nothing to exploit, no scandal to uncover, no weakness to leverage. They couldn't beat him fairly, so they decided to destroy him unfairly. And to do that, they would need to use the one thing Daniel would never compromise: his faith. Chapter 3. The Plot Against Prayer. The conspirators gathered in secret. These were not common criminals. They were influential men, powerful men, men whose pride had been bruised by a foreigner's success, men whose ambition had been thwarted by a man who wouldn't play their games. They sat in a private chamber, voices low, plotting the destruction of a righteous man. One of them spoke first. "We've been over his record a dozen times. There's nothing. No bribes, no corruption, no scandals, no mistakes. The man is spotless." Another official leaned back, frustrated. How is that even possible? Everyone has something to hide. Everyone makes deals, cuts corners, looks the other way. But not Daniel. It's like he's carved from stone. He's not stone. third voice interjected. "He's flesh and blood like the rest of us. He has a weakness. We just haven't found it yet." They sat in silence, considering. Then one of them, perhaps the shrewdest of the group, spoke with cold clarity. "We will never find any basis for charges against this man unless it has something to do with the law of his God." The room went still. Everyone understood immediately. It was brilliant. Ruthless, but brilliant. Daniel's faith was his defining characteristic. Everyone knew he prayed. Everyone knew he worshipped the God of Israel. Everyone knew he was devout, disciplined, consistent. He prayed 3 times a day, every day, without fail. It was as predictable as the sunrise. And if they could make that faithfulness illegal, even temporarily, they could trap him. The plan began to take shape. They would craft a law that seemed reasonable on the surface, but was designed with one target in mind, a law that would appeal to the king's ego while setting a trap for Daniel's faith. One of the officials leaned forward, sketching out the details. "We approach the king together, all of us. We present a unified front. We tell him that the advisors, governors, and satraps have all agreed on a new decree." "What kind of decree?" another asked. "A loyalty decree. For 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being, except the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. We frame it as a way to unify the empire, to strengthen the king's authority during this time of transition. And we make it irrevocable. According to the law of the Medes and Persians, once the king signs it, it cannot be changed, not even by the king himself." The others nodded slowly, seeing the elegance of the trap. 30 days was short enough to seem reasonable. The flattery would appeal to Darius, and the irrevocable nature of Persian law would ensure that once Daniel was caught there would be no escape, no loopholes, no mercy. "Daniel will never stop praying," one of them said with certainty. "Exactly," the architect of the plan replied. "He'll pray. We'll catch him. The king will have no choice but to enforce the law, and Daniel will be thrown to the lions." It was a perfect trap. Cruel, calculated, and almost certainly effective. They rehearsed their approach, refining their pitch to the king. They would emphasize unity, loyalty, and the strength of Darius's rule. They would make it sound like a collective decision, not a personal vendetta. They would hide their true motive behind a veil of political wisdom, and then they would wait for Daniel to do exactly what they knew he would do, wait for faithfulness to become a crime, wait for the trap to spring. They left the meeting with smiles on their faces. Daniel's days were numbered, and they had just lit the fuse. Chapter 4. A decree of death. The officials approached King Darius the next day. They came as a group, dozens of them, creating the impression of consensus and unity. They bowed respectfully, their faces arranged in expressions of concern and loyalty. "May King Darius live forever," they began, using the traditional greeting. "The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all consulted together. We have agreed that your majesty should establish a royal decree and enforce it strictly." Darius listened, intrigued. These were his top officials. If they had come to agreement on something, it was worth hearing. One of them continued, "We propose that for the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. This will demonstrate the unity of the empire under your rule. It will show that all loyalty, spiritual and temporal, flows through you." Another official added, "It will strengthen your authority during this time of transition. The people need to see that the empire is stable, that leadership is clear, that there is one central power they can trust." It was flattery, and it worked. Darius was a capable king, but like all rulers, he was not immune to ego. The idea of being elevated to a position of supreme reverence, even temporarily, was appealing. It seemed like a harmless gesture. 30 days wasn't long, and surely his subjects would have no problem directing their prayers to him for such a brief period. What Darius didn't know, what he couldn't see, was the trap hidden beneath the surface. The officials had carefully avoided mentioning Daniel. They had made it sound like a general decree, not a targeted attack. And Darius, trusting their counsel, saw no reason to refuse. "Very well," the king said. "Draft the decree. I will sign it." The officials moved quickly. They prepared the document with meticulous care, ensuring every word was precise, every clause was clear. The decree stated that for 30 days, no one in the empire could pray to any god or person except King Darius. Violation of this law would result in immediate execution by being thrown into the lion's den. And then they added the critical phrase, "This decree is issued in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked." Darius reviewed the document and signed it. His royal seal was pressed into the wax. The decree became law, irrevocable, absolute, binding even on the king who had issued it. The officials took the signed decree and distributed it throughout the empire. Heralds proclaimed it in the streets. Scribes posted it in public places. Within hours, everyone in Babylon knew, for the next 30 days, all prayers must go through the king. To pray to anyone else, any god, any person, was to invite death. And in his chambers, Daniel heard the news. Chapter 5. The Choice of Obedience. Daniel was in the middle of his afternoon work when the decree reached him. A messenger brought word, reading the proclamation aloud with official formality. Daniel listened carefully, his face calm, his mind sharp. He understood immediately what this meant. This was not a general decree. It was aimed at him. The timing, the specificity, the irrevocable nature, it all pointed to a coordinated effort to destroy him. He knew who was behind it. He could name the officials who had always resented him, who had envied his position, who had waited for an opportunity like this. He understood their strategy. They had crafted a law that would force him to choose between his God and his life. Daniel thanked the messenger and dismissed him. Then he sat alone, considering his options. He could comply with the decree, just for 30 days. It wasn't forever. He could pray silently in his heart where no one could see. He could close his windows, lock his doors, and keep his devotion private. He could survive the 30 days and then return to his normal practices once the decree expired. Many people would have chosen that path, and they would have justified it with reasonable arguments. God knows my heart. He understands. He wouldn't want me to die needlessly. I can serve him better alive than dead. This is just a temporary compromise. It's wisdom, not cowardice. But Daniel didn't see it that way. To him, hiding his faith was the same as denying it, and denying God, even to save his own life, was unthinkable. Prayer, for Daniel, was not just a religious duty. It was communion. It was relationship. It was the lifeline that connected him to the source of all wisdom, strength, and peace. To stop praying, even for a month, would be to cut himself off from the very thing that made him who he was. And there was something else, something deeper. Daniel understood that faithfulness is not proven in comfort. It's proven in pressure. It's easy to worship when worship costs nothing. It's easy to obey when obedience is convenient. But what does faith look like when it comes with a price? When devotion demands sacrifice? When following God means walking into danger? That's when faith is real. That's when it counts. That's when it reveals what's actually in a person's heart. Daniel had lived his entire life with integrity. He had served pagan kings with honesty. He had navigated political intrigue with honour. He had refused to compromise in 1,000 small ways over the course of decades. And now, in what might be the final test of his life, he would not bend. So when the time came for his evening prayer, Daniel did what he had always done. He went to his room, the same room where he had prayed for years, the same room with windows facing west, toward Jerusalem, the same room where he had knelt thousands of times before. He opened the windows, not as an act of defiance, not as a political statement, not to make a point, but because that's what he had always done, because prayer was not something to be hidden or whispered in secret, because his relationship with God was not shameful, and he would not treat it as if it were. He knelt down on the floor, his old knees pressing into the familiar stone. He raised his hands, he closed his eyes, and he prayed. He thanked God for his faithfulness, for sustaining him through decades of exile, for granting him favour with kings, for protecting his people even in captivity. He prayed for wisdom, for strength, for the exiles scattered throughout the empire. He prayed for King Darius, that God would guide him. He prayed for his enemies, that God would have mercy on them. And he prayed with peace, not with fear, not with anxiety, not with doubt, but with the calm assurance of someone who had walked with God for so long that trust had become instinct. Outside in the shadows across the courtyard, his enemies watched. They had positioned themselves carefully, where they could see through the open windows without being seen themselves. They had been waiting for this moment, counting on it. And now, as the evening light faded, they saw exactly what they had expected to see. Daniel, on his knees, hands raised, lips moving in prayer, facing Jerusalem, praying to the God of Israel, exactly as they knew he would. The officials exchanged glances. Smiles crept across their faces, silent gestures of satisfaction. They had him. The trap had worked. Now all they had to do was spring it. They watched Daniel finish his prayer, watched him stand slowly, his joints stiff with age, watched him close his eyes for a final moment of silent communion, and then they turned and left, moving quickly through the darkening streets toward the palace. They had a report to make and a righteous man to destroy. Chapter 6. The Arrest. The officials wasted no time. They went directly to King Darius, their voices urgent but controlled, their faces arranged in expressions of righteous concern. They found the king in his private chambers, reviewing documents by lamplight. He looked up as they entered, surprised by the late visit. "Your Majesty," one of them began, bowing deeply, "we come with a matter of great importance, a matter that concerns the law you recently signed." Darius set down his scroll, giving them his full attention. "Go on. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king's brow furrowed slightly. "Yes, I signed that decree. It stands, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." The officials nodded, their trap closing. "That is correct, Your Majesty. The law cannot be repealed, not even by you." Darius waited, sensing something beneath their words. One of the officials stepped forward, his voice carefully neutral. "Your Majesty, we regret to inform you that one of your officials has violated this decree. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day to his God." The words hit Darius like a physical blow. Daniel, his most trusted official, the one man he had planned to elevate above all others, the one man whose counsel he relied on, whose integrity he trusted, whose wisdom he valued above all his other advisors, caught in a trap that Darius himself had signed into law. The king's face went pale, his hands clenched. He looked at the officials, and in their eyes he saw something that made his stomach turn. Satisfaction. They weren't reporting a crime, they were celebrating a victory. Darius realized in that moment what had happened. He had been played, manipulated, used as a weapon against Daniel. The decree had never been about unity or loyalty. It had been about removing the one man who stood in the way of their ambitions, and he, Darius, king of the Medo-Persian Empire, had signed the order himself. "Get out," Darius said quietly, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. The officials hesitated. "Your Majesty, the law must be enforced." "I said get out!" The king's voice rose to a roar. "Leave me, now!" They bowed and withdrew, but their work was done. The trap was sprung, the law was clear, and there was nothing the king could do about it. Darius spent the rest of the day in anguish. He summoned his legal advisors, his counselors, his scholars. He reviewed the law from every angle, searching desperately for a loophole, an exception, a technicality, anything that could save Daniel. But Persian law was absolute. Once a decree was signed and sealed, it could not be altered. Not by circumstances, not by new information, not even by the king who had issued it. The law of the Medes and Persians was designed to be unbreakable, to ensure that royal decrees carried absolute authority, and now that unbreakable law was about to kill the best man in the empire. Darius paced his chambers, his mind racing. Could he delay the execution? Could he reinterpret the law? Could he grant Daniel a pardon? No. The officials returned throughout the day, reminding him of the law. They were relentless, sensing that the king might try to find a way out. Each time they spoke with false respect, but their message was clear. The law must be enforced. Daniel must die. "Remember, your majesty," they said again and again, "according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." As the sun began to set, Darius had exhausted every option. There was no way out. The law was clear, and his own signature had sealed Daniel's fate. With a heart heavier than stone, King Darius gave the order. Daniel was to be arrested and brought to the lion's den immediately. Chapter 7. The Night Among Lions. The lion's den was located on the outskirts of the city, carved into a rocky hillside. It was not a cage or an enclosure. It was a pit, a deep stone chamber accessible only from above. A vertical shaft led down into darkness, and at the bottom the lions waited. These were not ordinary lions. They were kept hungry, trained to be aggressive, used specifically for executions. The den was a place of terror, a final destination for criminals and traitors. No one who entered the pit came out alive. Daniel was brought there under guard as the last light of day faded. A crowd had gathered, palace officials, curious citizens, people who had heard the news and come to witness the execution of the famous Hebrew. The officials who had orchestrated this stood at the front, barely concealing their triumph. They watched as Daniel was led to the edge of the pit, his hands bound, his face calm. King Darius was there too. He had come himself, unable to stay away, hoping against hope for some last-minute miracle. He looked at Daniel, and his eyes were filled with grief. Daniel met the king's gaze. There was no accusation in his eyes, no bitterness, no resentment, just peace, a deep, unshakable peace, that transcended circumstance. Darius stepped forward, his voice breaking. "Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." It was all he could offer, a hope, a prayer, a desperate wish that somehow, some way, the God of the Hebrews would intervene where the king could not. Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the king's words. Then he was led to the edge of the pit. Ropes were lowered. Daniel was bound to them. And then, slowly, he was lowered into the darkness. The crowd watched in silence as he descended, down through the narrow shaft, past rough stone walls into the blackness below. And then the ropes went slack. He had reached the bottom. From above, those gathered at the edge could hear sounds, movement, low growls, the scrape of claws on stone. The lions had caught his scent. A massive stone, too heavy for any man to move alone, was rolled over the opening of the pit. It settled into place with a hollow thud, sealing Daniel inside. The king's signet ring was pressed into clay and affixed to the stone. The seals of the nobles were added. It was official, legal, irreversible. Daniel was entombed with death itself. And then, silence. The crowd began to disperse. The officials left, satisfied. The guards returned to their posts. But King Darius remained, staring at the sealed stone, his face etched with torment. Finally, his attendants gently urged him back to the palace. He went, but he found no rest there. Darius returned to his chambers, but he could not eat. Servants brought him food, delicacies prepared by the palace chefs, but he waved them away. The thought of eating while Daniel was in the pit made him sick. He dismissed his musicians, his entertainers, his concubines. He wanted no distraction, no comfort, no pleasure. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, tormented by images of what was happening in that dark pit. Was Daniel still alive? Had the lions attacked immediately? Was he suffering? Was he afraid? Or had it already ended? The king could not stop thinking about Daniel's final words. "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Darius had said it as a prayer, but he didn't know if he believed it. Could any god save a man from lions? Could any power overcome the natural order? The night stretched on. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Darius lay awake, listening to the silence of the palace, imagining the sounds in the pit. Growls, roars, screams. But he heard nothing, only silence. And he did not know if that was a good sign or a terrible one. Below the earth, in the darkness of the pit, something extraordinary was happening. Daniel had landed softly on the stone floor. He had expected impact, braced for it, but the descent had been gentle. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he became aware of shapes moving around him. Large shapes, muscular bodies covered in fur, eyes gleaming in the faint light from above. The lions. There were several of them, males and females, powerful creatures, apex predators, capable of tearing a man apart in seconds. Daniel could smell them, the scent of animals, of meat, of danger. He could hear their breathing, the soft pad of their paws on stone. And then he felt something else, a presence, not physical, not visible, but undeniable, as real as the stone beneath him, as certain as his own heartbeat, an angel. Daniel could not see the angel clearly. There was a sense of light, of form, of otherness. But more than that, there was an overwhelming sense of protection, of authority, of divine power that filled the space and held back the natural instincts of the beasts. The lions approached Daniel. They circled him, their breath hot on his skin. They sniffed at him, assessing him, their muscles tense and ready. But they did not attack. They could not. Something held them back. Something closed their mouths. Not metaphorically, literally. The angel of the Lord stood between Daniel and death, and the lions, creatures of instinct and hunger, were rendered harmless. Daniel sat down on the stone floor. His bound hands made it awkward, but he managed. And then he did something that would have seemed insane to any observer. He rested. He leaned back against the wall of the pit. He closed his eyes, and he slept, not fitfully, not anxiously, but peacefully, because he was not alone, because the God he had served for a lifetime had not abandoned him, because even here, in this place of death, divine presence was nearer than fear. The lions settled around him. Some lay down, some continued to pace, but none of them touched him. Throughout the long night, as King Darius lay awake in agony, Daniel rested in the presence of God. And when morning came, the king rose before dawn, unable to wait any longer. Chapter 8. Divine Protection. At the first light of dawn, King Darius was already on his way to the lion's den. He didn't wait for attendants. He didn't summon guards. He went himself, moving through the empty streets with a desperation that bordered on frenzy. He reached the hillside as the sun broke the horizon, casting golden light across the stone. The sealed entrance stood before him, undisturbed. The clay seals were intact. No one had tampered with it. Darius approached slowly, his heart pounding. His mind was filled with dread. He expected to find silence, death, the awful confirmation that Daniel was gone. But he had to know. He had to see. Even if it meant confronting the worst, he owed Daniel that much. The king stood at the edge of the pit and called out. His voice cracked with emotion. "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" For a moment there was nothing, only silence. The kind of silence that crushes hope, the kind that confirms every fear. Darius felt his knees weaken. He had been a fool to hope, a fool to believe, a fool to think that, and then a voice, clear, calm, alive. "May the king live forever," Darius gasped. His hands flew to the stone, gripping the rough surface as if to steady himself. "Daniel! Daniel!" "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight." Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." Tears streamed down Darius's face. He shouted orders to the guards who had followed him. "Lift him out! Get him out now! Break the seals! Move the stone!" The guards rushed forward. They broke the clay seals, destroying the official markings. They strained against the massive stone, pushing it aside with great effort. The opening was revealed, and ropes were quickly lowered into the darkness. Daniel grabbed hold of the ropes and they pulled him up. Slowly, carefully, he emerged from the pit, rising from death itself. When he reached the surface, Darius rushed to him. The king examined him closely, searching for injuries, blood, wounds, anything that would indicate the horrors of the night. But there was nothing. Not a scratch, not a bruise, not a torn garment. Daniel stood before him as if he had spent the night in his own bed, not in a pit of predators. His clothes were intact, his breathing was steady, his eyes were clear. He looked rested, at peace, unharmed. It was impossible, and yet undeniable. The guards peered down into the pit, and what they saw confirmed the miracle. The lions were there, prowling, agitated now, their hunger evident. These were not tame animals, they were killers, and yet for an entire night they had not touched Daniel. Darius embraced Daniel, weeping openly. "I thought I had lost you. I thought—" His voice failed him. Daniel placed a hand on the king's shoulder. "God is faithful, your majesty. He has always been faithful, even here." The king stepped back, looking at Daniel with a mixture of awe and wonder. "Your God. He did this. He saved you." "Yes," Daniel said simply. "He sent his angel. The angel shut the mouths of the lions." Darius turned to the guards, his grief transforming into rage. "Bring them to me. All of them. Every official who brought charges against Daniel. Bring them here. Now." The officials were found in the city, some still celebrating what they thought was their victory. They were dragged from their homes, their faces confused at first, then horrified as they saw Daniel standing alive beside the king. Darius looked at them with cold fury. "You sought to destroy a righteous man. You used my authority to commit murder. You manipulated the law and manipulated me. You will face the fate you intended for him." The conspirators began to protest, to plead, to make excuses. But Darius silenced them with a gesture. "You wanted the lion's den? You will have it." The officials were seized, not just them, but their families as well. In the justice system of the ancient world, the guilt of a traitor often extended to his household. It was brutal, it was harsh. But it was the law. They were brought to the edge of the pit, and one by one they were thrown in. This time, there was no angel. This time, the lions were not restrained. The Bible records it plainly. Before they even reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them. The same beasts that had ignored Daniel for an entire night fell upon the conspirators with savage speed. There was no mercy, no delay, only swift, terrible justice. The sounds that came from the pit were awful and brief. Within moments, it was over. Darius turned away, his expression grim. He felt no satisfaction in their deaths, only a deep weariness, a recognition that evil, left unchecked, destroys itself. But there was something else, something that stirred in the king's heart, a recognition of power beyond human understanding, a glimpse of something divine. He turned to Daniel. "Your God, tell me about him." And Daniel did. Chapter 9. A Decree of Truth King. Darius returned to his palace, but he could not rest. The events of the past day had shaken him to his core. He had witnessed something that defied explanation, something that challenged everything he thought he understood about the world, about power, about the gods. He had seen a man survive the unsurvivable. He had seen beasts tamed by invisible authority. He had seen faith vindicated in the most dramatic way imaginable, and it had changed him. Darius summoned his scribes. "I want to issue a decree, not a law that can be manipulated or twisted, a declaration of truth. something that will reach every corner of the empire. The scribes prepared their materials, waiting for the king's words. Darius paced as he spoke, his voice filled with conviction. "Write this, to all peoples, nations, and men of every language throughout the land. May you prosper greatly." The scribes wrote quickly, capturing every word. "I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel." The scribes paused, surprised, but Darius continued, his voice gaining strength. "For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." It was an extraordinary proclamation, a pagan king publicly honouring the God of Israel, not because of political pressure, not because of tradition, but because he had seen the evidence with his own eyes. The decree was copied and distributed throughout the empire. From India to Ethiopia, across 127 provinces, the message went out. Not a command to worship exclusively, not a forced conversion, but a recognition, an acknowledgement, a testimony. The God of Daniel was real, and he was worthy of reverence. In Jewish communities scattered throughout the empire, the news was received with tears of joy. For decades they had lived as exiles, their faith marginalized, their God dismissed as the deity of a conquered people. But now the most powerful king on earth had declared that their God was the living God, that his kingdom would never end. It was vindication, not just for Daniel, but for all of them. And Daniel simply continued doing what he had always done. He served faithfully. He prayed consistently. He honoured God quietly. His position was not only restored, it was elevated. The king's trust in him deepened beyond measure. His influence grew. His reputation spread far beyond the borders of Persia, carried by the story of the night he spent among lions and walked out unharmed. But Daniel did not boast. He did not write memoirs or seek fame or leverage his miraculous survival for political gain. He remained the same man he had always been, humble, faithful, devoted. Years passed. Daniel continued to serve under Darius and later under Cyrus the Persian. He witnessed the decree that allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. He saw the beginning of the fulfillment of prophecies he had prayed over for decades, and through it all he remained a man of prayer, 3 times a day, every day, windows open, facing Jerusalem, kneeling before the God who had never abandoned him. His faith had been tested in the most extreme way imaginable, and it had held. Not because Daniel was special, but because the God he served was faithful. The lion's den had been meant to silence him. Instead, it became a pulpit, a testimony that would echo through generations, proof that no empire, no decree, no threat could separate a faithful soul from the God they serve. Chapter 10. Legacy of Faithfulness. The story of Daniel and the lion's den would be told and retold for thousands of years. It would inspire countless believers facing persecution, pressure, and impossible choices. It would become a symbol of what faith looks like when tested by fire, or in this case, by fangs. But what made Daniel's story so powerful was not just the miracle, it was the man. Daniel didn't become faithful the night he was thrown into the den. He had been faithful every day before that, for decades, in obscurity and in prominence, when it was easy and when it was hard. His faith was not reactive, it was rooted. He had established patterns of devotion long before they became costly. He had built a life around prayer, not because he anticipated a crisis, but because prayer was the foundation of his relationship with God. When the test came, he didn't have to decide what kind of man he would be. He already knew. He had decided years before, in 1,000 small daily choices. That's the real lesson of Daniel's story. Faithfulness is not forged in the moment of crisis. It's forged in the moments no one sees. In the quiet mornings and evenings, in the daily discipline of showing up, kneeling down, and praying even when you don't feel like it, even when no one is watching, even when it seems like it doesn't matter, because those unseen moments, those private acts of devotion, are what carry you through when faithfulness becomes costly. Daniel's enemies knew this about him. They knew he would never stop praying because prayer was not a habit for Daniel. It was who he was. It was as essential to him as breathing. To ask Daniel to stop praying was to ask him to stop being Daniel, and that's what made him dangerous to them. Not his intelligence, though he was brilliant. Not his influence, though he had plenty. But his integrity, his consistency, his refusal to compromise. In a world built on negotiation and political manoeuvring, Daniel was immovable. And immovable men are threatening to those whose power depends on everyone playing along. But to God, Daniel's faithfulness was precious. It was the kind of devotion that moves heaven. Not loud devotion, not showy devotion, but consistent, costly, quiet devotion. The kind that says, I will worship you whether you rescue me or not. Whether it's safe or dangerous. Whether people applaud or condemn. That's the kind of faith that shuts the mouths of lions. After Daniel's miraculous survival, his influence in the Persian court only grew. But more importantly, his testimony reached far beyond the palace. Jews throughout the empire heard the story and were encouraged. Their God had not forgotten them. Their faith was not foolish. Even in exile, even under foreign rule, God was still sovereign. Daniel's story also reached future generations. When Jewish children heard about the lion's den, they learned that God could be trusted in the darkest circumstances. When young believers faced persecution in the early church, they remembered Daniel and took courage. When reformers stood against corrupt institutions, when missionaries entered hostile territories, when ordinary believers faced pressure to deny their faith, they remembered the old man who refused to stop praying. Daniel became a symbol, but he would have hated that. He never wanted to be a symbol. He just wanted to be faithful, and in being faithful he became more than a symbol. He became a testimony, living proof that God honours those who honour him, that faithfulness is never wasted, even when it looks like it will cost everything. Epilogue: courage and quiet devotion. The story of Daniel is not just about lions, it's about choices. Small, quiet, daily choices that define who we are when the cost of faithfulness rises. Faith is built in the ordinary moments, in the decision to pray when you're tired, to worship when you're discouraged, to trust when circumstances scream that trust is foolish. These are the moments that matter. These are the moments that prepare you for the test you can't predict. Daniel didn't suddenly become a man of faith when the decree was signed. He had been that man for 80 years, through exile, through service to pagan kings, through the rise and fall of empires. His faith was tested constantly in small ways and large ways, and each time he chose faithfulness. When he was a young man, he chose to honour God's dietary laws even when it seemed unnecessary. When he interpreted troubling dreams for Nebuchadnezzar, he spoke truth even when it was dangerous. When the kingdom changed hands, he continued to serve with integrity, even though he could have retired, disappeared, faded into obscurity. Every small choice reinforced the pattern. Every act of obedience deepened the roots. So when the ultimate test came, when faithfulness meant facing death, Daniel didn't have to think about it. He simply kept doing what he had always done. That's the power of consistency. That's the strength of a life built on daily devotion, and it's available to anyone. Daniel was not superhuman. He was not born with extraordinary courage. He was a man who chose again and again, day after day, to trust God, to pray, to obey, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was difficult, even when it cost him everything. The question the story poses to us is not, could you survive a night with lions? The question is, are you building a life that would prepare you for that night? Are you praying when no one is watching? Are you choosing integrity when compromise would be easier? Are you trusting God in the small moments so that trust becomes instinct in the big ones? Because the truth is, most of us will never face a literal lion's den, but we will all face moments where faithfulness becomes costly, where obedience means sacrifice, where following God means swimming against the current. We'll face pressure at work to cut corners. We'll face social pressure to stay silent about our beliefs. We'll face internal pressure to prioritize comfort over conviction. We'll face 1,000 small moments where we have to choose between what's easy and what's right. And in those moments, we'll discover what we're actually made of. We'll discover whether our faith is real or just theoretical. We'll discover whether we've been building on rock or on sand. Daniel built on rock. And when the storm came, when the decree was signed, when the officials gathered, when the pit yawned open, he stood firm. Not because he was brave, but because he had spent a lifetime learning to trust. The lions couldn't touch him, not because they lacked teeth or hunger, but because something greater was present in that pit. Something sovereign, something kind, something that sees the faithfulness of those who serve in quiet devotion and does not forget. God sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions, but God had been with Daniel long before that night. In the daily prayers, in the decades of service, in the countless small acts of faithfulness that no one saw. That's where miracles really happen. Not just in the dramatic moment of rescue, but in the quiet formation of a soul that's learned to trust, in the daily discipline that prepares a heart to endure, in the choice to keep praying when prayer seems pointless, to keep obeying when obedience is costly, to keep believing when everyone around you thinks you're foolish. Daniel prayed with his windows open because hiding was never an option, because he knew that faith practiced in secret, out of fear, is faith that has already begun to erode. He chose visibility, he chose consistency, he chose God, even when it cost him everything, and God honoured that choice. Not because Daniel was perfect, but because his devotion was genuine, not because he was fearless, but because he trusted something greater than fear. The lion's den is not just a story from the past, it's a symbol, a reminder, a mirror. We all face moments where faithfulness becomes inconvenient, where truth becomes costly, where integrity demands sacrifice. And in those moments, we get to choose, hide or stand, compromise or remain, bend or hold. Daniel chose to hold, and in doing so, he discovered something ancient and eternal. Even in the darkest dens, God's presence remains nearer than fear, so the question remains, not for Daniel, but for us. What do we do when faithfulness becomes dangerous? When obedience is outlawed? When following God means risking everything we've built? Do we pray with our windows open, or do we close them just to survive? Daniel's answer echoes across the centuries, and it's not complicated, it's not dramatic, it's not loud. It's simply this: keep praying, keep trusting, keep standing, even when the lions are waiting, even when the law's signed, even when everyone is watching, because God is nearer than fear, and his faithfulness never fails, even in the den.